Deep in the labyrinthine corridors of the Imperial Palace on Terra, past the gleaming halls where the custodians stand their eternal vigil, there exists a chamber that few have ever entered. Within this room stand 20 plinths, each meant to bear the statue of one of the Emperor's most magnificent creations, his gene-crafted sons, the Primarchs. 18 of these plinths hold their designated statues, immortalized in stone and precious metals, each face captured in stern nobility or battle-ready determination. But 2 plinths stand eternally empty, not broken, not toppled in some ancient catastrophe, simply vacant, as though the figures that should occupy them never existed at all. The second and the 11th, the forgotten and the purged. 2 Primarchs whose names have been scoured from every record, whose deeds have been excised from every history, whose very existence has become the Imperium's darkest and most enduring secret. Where the 9 traitor Primarchs who turned to chaos are remembered with hatred and their names spoken as curses, these 2 are remembered not at all. Their erasure is so complete, so absolute, that even their brother Primarchs who once knew them, who once fought alongside them, who once called them kin, have had their memories suppressed by psychic compulsion. When they speak of the lost, it is always with a haunted sadness, a grief tinged with something that might be fear or shame or both. This is the greatest mystery in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not the nature of the Emperor's plans, not the true origins of chaos, not the location of the disappeared Primarchs like Vulcan or Leman Russ or the Lion in the modern era. This mystery towers above them all because it is the one deliberately, painstakingly, ruthlessly concealed by the Emperor himself, the one secret that was considered too dangerous for even the Imperium's most trusted warriors to remember. What could possibly warrant such totality of erasure? What sins could be so grave that even the 9 traitor Primarchs, who nearly destroyed the Imperium, who unleashed the Horus Heresy and damned half the galaxy to chaos, are more acceptable to remember than these 2? What happened during the Great Crusade that was worse than the greatest rebellion in human history? Today we're going to explore everything we know about the Lost Primarchs. We'll examine every hint, every reference, every cryptic comment scattered across decades of Black Library novels and codices. We'll delve into the Rangdan Xenocides, those nightmare wars that threatened to destroy the Imperium before the heresy even began. We'll investigate the role of Leman Russ and his space wolves as the Emperor's executioners. We'll explore the evidence of what became of the Space Marines who served under these vanished lords. And we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that some questions are designed never to have answers, that some mysteries are more powerful for remaining unsolved. The Lost. Primarchs represent something profound about the Warhammer 40,000 universe itself. They are the shadows cast by absence, the holes in the historical record that paradoxically tell us more than complete documentation ever could. They remind us that even in a setting as thoroughly detailed and expansively explored as this one, there are still dark corners where even the boldest historians fear to tread. They embody the tragic truth that sometimes the greatest failures are those we cannot even bear to acknowledge. So let us descend into those dark corners. Let us examine the empty plinths and ask what they once held. Let us speak the unspoken and consider the unconsidered. Let us do what the Imperium itself forbids and remember as best we can the forgotten and the purged. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what the Primarchs were meant to be. The story begins in the hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient Terra, in the waning years of the Age of Strife, when the Emperor of Mankind was consolidating his power over a fractured, war-torn homeworld. The Unification Wars had raged for centuries, petty tyrants and techno-barbarian warlords carving out kingdoms from the radioactive ashes of old Earth. But the Emperor had a vision that extended far beyond Terra, beyond even the Sol system. He saw a galaxy that had once belonged to humanity, scattered colonies of mankind cut off from each other by warp storms, regressing into barbarism or falling prey to xenos predators. He saw a great crusade that would reunite these lost children of Earth under one banner, one Imperium, one truth. But such an undertaking would require more than ordinary soldiers, more even than the superhuman space marines he was developing. The Emperor needed generals, commanders, and leaders who could inspire millions, who could prosecute wars across entire star systems, who could embody the ideals of the Imperium made manifest. He needed sons. The Primarch project was perhaps the Emperor's greatest work of genetic engineering, an undertaking that required not just mastery of biology and science, but also a deep understanding of the warp itself. Each Primarch was to be a unique creation, a flawless fusion of human excellence and something more, something touched by divinity itself. They would be immortal, or as close to it as made no difference. They would possess strength that could shatter ceramite, speed that could track bolter rounds in flight, and intellects vast enough to comprehend the most intricate strategic calculations in moments. They would be charismatic beyond measure, natural leaders who inspired devotion and loyalty in all who served under them, and each would possess unique gifts, specialized traits that would make them suited to particular roles in the Great Crusade. The Emperor laboured in his hidden laboratories, combining his own genetic material with the fruits of his accumulated knowledge, both scientific and sorcerous. He did not work alone. The accounts vary, but what is certain is that at some point in this process, the Emperor made a bargain with the powers of the warp. Whether he intended to honour that bargain is a matter of heated theological debate. What is undeniable is that he took what he needed from the dark gods, the knowledge of how to weave warp energies into biological matter, how to create beings that could touch the immaterium without being destroyed by it, how to craft something that was more than human but not quite God. The result was 20 incubation pods, each containing a developing infant that would grow into one of these magnificent beings. The Emperor watched over them with something approaching paternal care, perhaps the only genuine emotion he allowed himself in those desperate times. He had numbered them, first through 20th, and prepared for each a legion of space marines crafted from their genetic template. These legions were already being formed, drawn from the warriors of terror who had proven themselves worthy, their bodies transformed with gene seed that bore the mark of their future Primarch's template. All was proceeding according to plan. Then chaos intervened. The accounts of what exactly happened vary. Some sources suggest the dark gods, enraged at the Emperor's theft of their secrets and his refusal to honour whatever bargain had been struck, tore open a rift in reality directly into the laboratory. Others hint at more complex machinations, a deliberate sabotage by agents who knew what they were doing. One controversial account even suggests that Erda, a powerful perpetual who had worked alongside the Emperor in creating the Primarchs, was the one who scattered them, believing the Emperor's plans for them would damn them all to servitude and death. Regardless of the mechanism, the result was catastrophic. A hole tore open in reality, and the pods containing the 20 infant Primarchs were pulled into the warp and hurled across the galaxy. What followed was perhaps the greatest disaster of the nascent Imperium, the moment when all the Emperor's carefully laid plans nearly came to ruin. The Primarchs were scattered to the void, their pods carrying them through the immaterium to crash upon distant worlds across the length and breadth of the galaxy. Each pod found a world, some pleasant, most horrific. Each infant Primarch survived, their preternatural resilience and rapidly developing powers allowing them to endure what would have killed any normal human. And each grew with supernatural speed, reaching physical maturity in a handful of years, their minds expanding to match their bodies, their innate gifts manifesting in ways that shaped the worlds around them. But they grew alone, separated from their father and from each other, raised by the cultures and peoples of their adopted homeworlds. They became products of their environments, even as they reshaped those environments with their presence. Some, like Leman, landed on relatively civilized worlds and were raised with education and purpose. Others, like Angron, found themselves in nightmares of slavery and butchery, and the Emperor, bereft of his sons, was forced to adjust his plans. The Great Crusade would begin, but without its intended commanders. The legions were given to Terran commanders, their full potential unrealized, waiting for the day when their Primarchs would be found and returned to them. The recovery of the Primarchs became one of the primary objectives of the early Great Crusade. As the Emperor's fleets pushed out from Terra, encountering and conquering or allying with human worlds across the galaxy, his agents searched for signs of his lost sons, and remarkably they found them. One by one, the Primarchs were located and in most cases reunited with their father. The Emperor's ability to find them borders on the miraculous. Despite them being scattered across the entire galaxy, despite having no maps to their locations, despite the vast gulfs of space and the unpredictable nature of warp travel, the Emperor found them all. Some scholars suggest this was because of a psychic link between father and sons, others that the Emperor had foreseen their landing sites, still others that Chaos, having scattered them, was pleased to see them gathered again for the corruption that would eventually come. Horus Lupercal was the first to be found, discovered on the moon of Chthoniya, and immediately became the Emperor's favoured son and most trusted general. Leman Russ came second, pulled from the frozen wastes of Fenris. One by one they were discovered, 18 bright stars brought back to illuminate the Imperium. Ferrus Manus from Medusa, Fulgrim from Chemos, Vulcan from Nocturne, Rogel Dawn from Inwit, Robuta Gilliman from Macrege, Magnus the Red from Prospero, Sanguinius from Bel, Lionel Johnson from Caliban, Perturabo from Olympia, Mortarion from Barbarus, Lorgar from Colchis, Jakatai Khan from Chagoris, Conrad Kurz from Nostramo, Angron from Nuceria, Corvus Corax from Deliverance, and finally, mysteriously, Alfarius Omegon, whose discovery is shrouded in as much secrecy as everything else about the 20th Legion. 18 sons recovered, 18 Primarchs given command of their legions, reshaping their adopted sons in their image, leading campaigns that conquered 1,000 upon 1,000 worlds in the Emperor's name. 18 brothers who would sometimes clash but always, or so it seemed, ultimately serve the same purpose. But there were 20 pods, 20 incubation chambers, 20 genetic templates from which 20 legions were forged. Where were the 2nd and the 11th? The historical records are maddeningly vague on this point, which is of course entirely intentional. What we can piece together from fragmentary evidence suggests that both were found, as were the others. Both took command of their legions, as did their brothers. Both prosecuted campaigns during the early to mid-phases of the Great Crusade, fighting for the Emperor's vision of a unified galaxy. There are hints that at least one of them attended meetings of the Primarchs, that the others knew them, even if we don't know their names or their personalities or their achievements. They were real. They existed. They were part of the Grand Brotherhood of the Emperor's Sons, part of the Great Crusade's triumphant advance across the stars, and then, at some point before the heresy, they were gone. Not dead in some glorious last stand like Ferrus Manus would be, not turned traitor like the Nine who would follow Horus into damnation. Simply erased, as thoroughly as if they had never been, their legions expunged from the rolls, their names deleted from every archive, their deeds struck from every history. An act of damnatio memoriae so complete that even speaking of them became forbidden, even remembering them became a kind of heresy. What could possibly justify such treatment? What could be worse than the traitors who nearly destroyed everything the Emperor had built? To answer that, we need to look at every scrap of evidence we have, every whispered hint, every cryptic reference that survived the purge. We need to examine the wars that were raging when they disappeared, the conflicts that tested the Imperium to its very limits. And we need to confront the possibility that some failures are too terrible to acknowledge, some sins too great to be remembered, some truths too dangerous to ever be fully known. When investigating any historical mystery, the first step is always to catalogue what we actually know, to separate confirmed fact from speculation and rumour. With the lost Primarchs, this is a particularly challenging task because the entire point of their erasure was to remove them from the historical record. Yet despite the Imperium's best efforts, Some evidence has survived, scattered across various sources like the pieces of a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a different aspect of the truth, but none sufficient to reveal the whole picture. Let us begin with the most literal evidence, the empty plinths themselves. In the vestry of the Imperial Palace on Terra, there once stood 20 statues representing the 20 Primarchs. We know this from several sources, most notably the short story The Lightning Tower by Dan Abnett, where Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, discovers these statues during a walk through the palace. The narrative specifically notes that the 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time, their statues removed or never completed. This is not destruction wrought by battle or time. These plinths were deliberately left empty, a conscious choice to leave gaps in the representation of the Emperor's sons. The very fact that they remain as empty plinths rather than being removed entirely suggests a kind of memorial, an acknowledgement of absence rather than a complete denial of existence. Similarly, in the anthology The Primarchs, specifically in Nick Kime's short story Feet of Iron, Ferrus Manus encounters 20 statues of Primarchs whose faces are covered by masks. He recognises all but 2 of them. Significantly, the masks covering these 2 unknown figures are split and almost destroyed, as though some great force had shattered them deliberately. This detail is particularly evocative because masks are symbols of identity, and destroyed masks suggest destroyed or prohibited identity, erased personhood. That Ferrus cannot recognise even the physical form of these 2 brothers, despite having once presumably known them, hints at the psychic memory wipes that would be confirmed in later sources. Perhaps the most famous visual evidence comes from the cover art for The Sigillite, an audio drama featuring Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand and most trusted advisor. On the cover, Malcador sits upon his throne, and adorning the arms of that throne are 2 skulls, marked with the Roman numerals 2 and 11. The symbolism here is stark and unsettling. Skulls are death, finality, extinction. That they adorn Malcador's throne specifically, rather than the Emperor's, might suggest that it was Malcador who was tasked with the grim work of implementing their erasure, of being the executioner of their memory, if not necessarily their bodies. Or perhaps they serve as a reminder of what can happen when even the Emperor's greatest creations fail, a memento mori for the Sigillite himself. But the most substantial evidence comes not from visual symbols, but from the Horus Heresy novels themselves, where characters occasionally make oblique references to the lost Primarchs, always carefully, always with the weight of forbidden knowledge. The novel The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden provides some of the most extensive discussion of the lost. In this book, the word-bearers are sent into the Eye of Terror, where they witness visions of the past, including the creation of the Primarchs. In these visions they see all 20 pods, all 20 infant Primarchs before the scattering. The demon Ingathel the Ascended speaks with them about the Primarchs' fates, and there is a brief discussion of the 2nd and 11th. Argyltal, the word-bearer captain, who serves as the reader's viewpoint character, witnesses the moment when the Gellerfields failed and the Primarchs were scattered. He sees the pods being flung across the galaxy, and in one poignant moment, he contemplates how things might have been different if he could go back and kill one of the Primarchs in infancy. Specifically, he considers the 11th Primarch, with one of the word-bearers suggesting that killing him would save us a lot of trouble and would unwrite a shameful future. This strongly implies that whatever the 11th Primarch did, it was shameful enough that even the word-bearers, who would go on to orchestrate humanity's greatest betrayal, recognised it as a terrible mistake. The phrase shameful future is particularly loaded because shame implies moral failure, not just tactical or strategic error. In the same novel, in a conversation taking place roughly 43 years before the Dropsite massacre that would mark the true beginning of the heresy's hot phase, Lorgar and Magnus discuss the lost Primarchs. Magnus makes a cryptic comment about how 9 Primarchs are gathered at this particular meeting, and that such a gathering hasn't happened since another time, at which point Mortarion cuts him off, and reminds him that the Emperor forbade them to speak of it. This exchange is revealing in several ways. First, it confirms that the other Primarchs do have memories, however suppressed, of their lost brothers. Second, it suggests there was a specific event, likely the purging of the Lost Legions, that involved multiple Primarchs gathering together. Third, it establishes that the Emperor himself commanded silence on this matter, making it not just politically sensitive, but actively forbidden. Later revelations from the audio drama The Sigillite add crucial detail to what happened. In this story, it's revealed that Malcador met with Rogal Dorn and Rabut Guilliman, and at their request, psychically suppressed the memories of all the surviving Primarchs regarding their two lost brothers. This wasn't done by Imperial decree or the Emperor's command, but at the request of two of the most stalwart loyalists among the Primarchs. Dorn and Guilliman specifically asked Malcador to make them forget because the knowledge of what had happened threatened the core ideals of the Great Crusade itself. Let that sink in for a moment. Two of the most rational, stable, and dedicated of the Emperor's sons believed that what had happened to their brothers was so terrible, so antithetical to everything the Crusade represented, that they asked to have their own memories erased rather than live with that knowledge. Additionally, Malcador reveals that the Space Marines of the Lost Legions did not share their Primarch's fate. Instead, they were mind-wiped, and attuned to new circumstances, their gene seed and service being too valuable to simply discard. This pragmatic detail tells us several things. First, whatever happened wasn't a simple battle where everyone died. Second, the Space Marines themselves weren't considered guilty of whatever their Primarchs had done. Third, the Emperor and his advisors were willing to repurpose even potentially tainted gene stock, rather than waste the resources, suggesting practical considerations mixed with whatever moral or strategic imperatives drove the purge. The question of what happened to these Marines is addressed indirectly in several sources. In The First Heretic, during a conversation between word-bearers, one character notes that the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, definitely swelled to eclipse all other legions around the time the 2nd and 11th were forgotten by Imperial archives. This is not presented as fact, but as rumour, speculation among the ranks, yet there is supporting evidence for the claim. Historical records show that around the time the Lost Legions disappear from Imperial notice, the Ultramarines did indeed become by far the largest of the Space Marine legions, eventually numbering well over 250,000 Astutz, when most legions numbered between 80,000 and 120,000. Rabut Guilliman's explanation for this growth was that Ultramar, the mini-empire he built around Macragge, was extraordinarily efficient at recruiting and training, with 500 worlds contributing to the Legion. But some have suggested that this massive size increase might have been supplemented by absorbing the remnants of the Lost Legions. There's also a suggestion that the Imperial fists might have taken in some of these Lost Space Marines. While less explicitly stated than the Ultramarines connection, there are hints that Dorn's Legion also experienced unusual growth, and the fact that Dorn was one of the two Primarchs who requested the memory wipe might indicate a personal connection to what happened. If Dorn was involved in whatever censure was carried out, if he felt responsible for the fate of his brothers, taking in their orphaned sons might have been a kind of penance. The timeline evidence is also crucial. We know from various sources that by the time of the raising of Monarchia, which occurs roughly 43 years before the Dropsite massacre, the Lost Primarchs are already gone. The Emperor's censure of Lorgar and the Word-Bearers references only 18 legions, not 20. This means whatever happened to the 2nd and 11th occurred well before the events that would lead to the heresy, in the earlier to middle stages of the Great Crusade. Some sources place it even earlier, suggesting the purge happened before even Lorgar's censure. The most specific timeline hint comes from the Horus Heresy Black Books published by Forge World. In the Horus Heresy Book 2 Massacre, there's a chronological timeline of major events during the Great Crusade. Two entries are particularly notable. For the years 965-M30 and 969-M30, the listed events simply read all data redacted, with notation that the Space Wolves Legion took part in both events. given that the Space Wolves were known to serve as the Emperor's executioners, and given that these redacted events occurred during the time frame when the Lost Primarchs would have been active, the implication is clear. These might be the actual purges, the moments when the 2nd and 11th Legions were destroyed or at least officially censured and dissolved. There's one more piece of particularly poignant evidence from the novel Fear to Tread by James Swallow. In a conversation between Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and his brother Horus, Sanguinius reveals the terrible secret of the Red Thirst, a flaw in the Blood Angel's gene seed that causes his warriors to become blood-drinking monsters. When Horus asks why he never told their father, Sanguinius replies with a phrase that has echoed through the fandom for years. "I will not be responsible for the erasure of the Blood Angels from Imperial history. I will not have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as my legion's only memorial." A third empty plinth. Sanguinius's fear is explicit and specific. He fears that if the Emperor learned of the Blood Angels' gene seed flaw, he would do to them what was done to the 2nd and 11th. This tells us several crucial things about the Lost Primarchs. First, at least some of the Primarchs know, or strongly suspect, that their lost brothers were purged due to gene seed problems or similar biological issues. Second, this purge was considered a real possibility, a precedent that made Sanguinius, one of the most beloved and loyal of the Primarchs, terrified enough to conceal a dire flaw from his father. Third, the punishment was severe enough that being completely erased from history seemed worse than trying to manage the flaw in secret. When we assemble all these pieces, a picture begins to emerge, though it remains frustratingly incomplete. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs were found, as were their brothers. They took command of their legions, they fought in the Great Crusade. At some point, likely somewhere between 860 M30 and 970 M30, something went catastrophically wrong. Whatever happened was severe enough that it couldn't be handled quietly or diplomatically. The Space Wolves, serving as the Emperor's executioners, were involved in at least 2 redacted incidents during this time frame. The Primarchs themselves were either killed or otherwise removed, so thoroughly that their very names and identities were expunged from all records. Their Space Marines were mind-wiped and likely distributed to other legions, primarily the Ultramarines. And the remaining Primarchs, at the request of Dawn and Guilliman, had their own memories of these events psychically suppressed by Malcador because the knowledge was considered too dangerous to the unity of the Great Crusade. But what actually happened? What could possibly warrant such extreme measures? To answer that, we need to look at the wars raging during this period, at the enemies that threatened to overwhelm the young Imperium before it could even truly establish itself. We need to examine the Rangdan Xenocides, campaigns so terrible that they would cost more lives than any conflict except the heresy itself. If you want to understand why the Lost Primarchs might have been purged, you need to understand the Rangdan Xenocides. These campaigns represent the closest the Imperium came to total annihilation before the Horus Heresy, a brush with extinction that was so traumatic, so costly, and so horrifying that it was deliberately suppressed in subsequent historical accounts. The fact that most citizens of the Imperium in the 41st millennium have never even heard of the Rangdan should tell you everything you need to know about how badly things went. The Rangdan Cerebvors were a xenos species encountered in the earliest waves of the Great Crusade as Imperial expeditionary fleets pushed into the eastern fringe and the galactic north, reaching toward the halo stars. If the populace of the Imperium had realized the dire peril posed by what lurked in those regions, they might never have left Terra at all. The Rangdan were not simply hostile aliens. They were a civilization possessed of such advanced technology and martial power that they represented an existential threat to humanity itself. Their technology was macabre and terrible, their weapons capable of horrors that defied understanding, and their very nature suggested something deeply wrong with them, something that went beyond mere xenophobia to approach genuine cosmic evil. The exact nature of the Rangdan is deliberately obscure in the sources, which themselves reflect the Imperium's attempts to suppress knowledge of them. What we know is that they were referred to as cerebrivores, a term suggesting that they consumed brains or nervous tissue, possibly incorporating the knowledge and capacities of their victims into themselves. They employed mind control technology that could enslave entire human populations, turning the Imperium's own citizens against it in a grotesque perversion of the unity the Emperor sought. Their war machines, called Oseovores and Macrobeasts, were massive creatures or constructs that rivaled Titans in power, and seemed to be alive in ways that violated the boundaries between organic and mechanical. They wielded weapons called shadow blasters that could atomize targets and fill entire battlefields with lethal radiation. And perhaps most terrifyingly, their war moons were enormous mobile fortresses that could match entire Imperial fleets in combat, city-sized engines of destruction that required the sacrifice of irreplaceable Gloriana-class battleships to overcome. The Rangdan Xenocides began around 860.M30, though some sources place the first encounters even earlier. They would stretch across 3 major phases, consuming decades of the Great Crusade and millions upon millions of lives. The first Xenocide saw Imperial expeditionary fleets simply disappear, entire battle groups entering Rangdan space and never emerging, swallowed whole by an enemy that gave no warning and left no survivors to report what had destroyed them. Worlds fell silent, dozens of Titan legions were obliterated, and the Imperium found itself facing an enemy that might actually be able to destroy it. The scale of mobilization required to fight the Rangdan was unprecedented. At least 9 Space Marine legions were committed to the conflict, including the 1st Legion Dark Angels, the 6th Legion Space Wolves, the 5th Legion White Scars, the 12th Legion World Eaters, the 14th Legion Death Guard, and the 19th Legion, whose Primarch Corvus Corax had not yet been found. Most significantly for our purposes, records also confirm that the 2nd Legion and the 11th Legion participated in these campaigns. This is one of the very few concrete facts we have about what the Lost Primarchs and their legions actually did. They fought the Rangdan. They were there, in the meat grinder, facing an enemy that killed Space Marines by the tens of thousands. The casualties were nightmarish. More than 80,000 Space Marines gave their lives across the 3 Xenocides, with millions of Imperial Army troops dying alongside them. To put this in perspective, most Space Marine legions numbered between 80,000 and 150,000 Astartes at their peak. The losses in the Rangdan Xenocides were equivalent to annihilating an entire legion. The Dark Angels in particular were devastated. Before the campaigns, they were the largest and most powerful of the Space Marine legions, numbering perhaps 100,000 warriors. By the end of the 3rd Xenocide, they had been reduced to a fraction of their strength, some sources claiming they were cut down to less than 10,000 survivors, others being slightly more generous, but still indicating catastrophic losses. They would never recover their former supremacy, and from that point forward, the Ultramarines would hold the title of largest legion. The Death Guard also suffered terribly, forced to recruit heavily from non-Barbaran stock just to maintain combat effectiveness. The Space Wolves, already a smaller legion, spent themselves like water holding back the Rangdan tide. Entire expeditionary fleets were consumed in the fighting. The Imperium threw everything it had at the Rangdan, committing not just Space Marines but elements of the Legio Titanicus, the Mechanicum's war machines, Imperial Knight houses and vast armies of the Imperial Army. And still the Rangdan pushed back, wave after wave of them crashing against the bulwarks of the Northern Imperium. The critical phase was the 3rd Rangdan Xenocide around 890-30. By this point the Imperium had identified the Rangdan's centre of power, a location called the Labyrinth of Night. The counterattack was led by Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, and Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves. Some sources suggest that at least 3 Primarchs were directly involved in the final assault. This was the breaking point, the moment when the Imperium's might was hurled against the Rangdan in a desperate bid to destroy them before they destroyed humanity. The Emperor himself was said to have intervened directly, shattering the Labyrinth of Night and finally breaking the Rangdan's coordinated resistance. Even after this victory, the war was not over. What followed was a decade of brutal biopogroms, systematic purges of Rangdan-controlled space carried out primarily by the Dark Angels and Space Wolves. These legions earned their grim reputations during this period. The Space Wolves became known as the Emperor's Executioners. The Dark Angels, less famously, gained a similar reputation as the Emperor's Exterminators. The purges were necessary because the Rangdan had enslaved human populations, binding them with neural shackles and turning them into living weapons. These humans could not be easily freed, and in many cases mercy demanded their destruction. Entire sectors were cleansed of all life, rendered barren to ensure no trace of Rangdan influence survived. It was ugly, necessary work, and it scarred both legions. The aftermath of the Xenocides reshaped the Great Crusade. The depletion of the Dark Angels and Space Wolves meant that other legions, particularly the Ultramarines, Lunar Wolves, and Imperial Fists, took on more prominent roles. The conflict demonstrated that the Imperium could face threats that dwarfed individual legion capacity, that even superhuman warriors could be overwhelmed by Xeno's power. It led to the development of new weapons of war, including the dreaded Psi Titans of the Ordo Sinister, psychic war engines inspired by the Rangdan's own constructs, and perhaps most significantly, it created a climate of fear and secrecy, a recognition that there were horrors in the galaxy that the Imperium's citizens were better off not knowing about. So where do the Lost Primarchs fit into all this? The connection is tantalizing but frustratingly vague. We know the 2nd and 11th Legions participated in the Rangdan Xenocides. We know that around the same time these campaigns were raging, the Lost Primarchs disappeared from Imperial records. We know that the Space Wolves, who served as the Emperor's executioners, were involved in both the purges of Rangdan space and in redacted incidents during the timeline when the Lost would have been active. And we know that whatever happened to the Lost was so shameful, so dangerous to the Crusade's ideals, that it had to be completely suppressed. Several theories emerge from this connection. The first, and perhaps most plausible, is contamination or corruption. The Rangdan employed mind control technology and seemed capable of some form of assimilation or infection. What if one or both of the Lost Primarchs were compromised by Rangdan technology? Primarchs were incredibly resistant to conventional forms of control, but the Rangdan were not a conventional threat. If a Primarch's mind were enslaved, if his legion began to be corrupted from within, the implications would be catastrophic. You couldn't simply defeat him in battle. His gene seed would still carry the taint. His legion's recruitment would spread the infection. The only solution would be complete extermination of the Primarch and his legion, followed by the erasure of all records to prevent anyone from studying or attempting to replicate what had gone wrong. The second theory involves failure of a different sort. Perhaps one of the Lost Primarchs tried to negotiate with the Rangdan, seeing in them a Xenos species advanced enough to be reasoned with, attempting to forge an alliance, or at least a peace, rather than prosecuting genocidal war. In the Imperium's ideology, particularly during the Great Crusade when the Emperor's xenophobia was at its height, attempting to ally with Xenos would be unforgivable heresy. If a Primarch had shown such xeno-sympathetic tendencies, if he had tried to spare Rangdan populations or integrate them into the Imperium, rather than annihilating them, it would explain both the severity of the punishment and the need for absolute secrecy. The Imperium couldn't allow any precedent for dealing peacefully with Xenos, couldn't tolerate any suggestion that the Emperor's uncompromising approach might have alternatives. A third possibility is more tragic, catastrophic loss. Perhaps one or both of the Lost Primarchs fell in battle against the Rangdan, not just killed but so utterly destroyed, their gene seeds so corrupted or lost that their legions could not continue. But why then the secrecy? Why not commemorate them as martyrs? Unless the manner of their death was so horrible, so utterly demoralizing, that acknowledging it would have shattered legion morale across the board. If a Primarch could be killed, consumed, assimilated, turned into something no longer recognizable as human, that knowledge could shake the foundations of Space Marine identity. Better to erase them entirely than to admit that even the Emperor's gene sons could suffer such a fate. A fourth theory suggests genetic breakdown. The Rangdan Xenocides were brutal enough that they might have triggered latent flaws in gene seed, accelerating whatever instabilities existed in certain Primarch bloodlines. Sanguinius's fear about the red thirst leading to erasia suggests this was a real possibility. If the 2nd or 11th Legion's gene seed began manifesting uncontrollable mutations during the stress of the Xenocides, if their Space Marines started devolving into monsters or madmen in significant numbers, the Emperor might have decided the bloodline was too unstable to continue. Unlike the Blood Angels, whose Sanguinius was powerful enough to keep the flaw contained, and whose loyalty was unquestioned, perhaps the lost Primarchs lacked the strength or will to manage their legion's genetic degradation. There's also the timeline problem that makes the Rangdan connection simultaneously compelling and puzzling. The Xenocides lasted from roughly 860 M30 to 890 M30, with the final purges continuing until 930. But some evidence suggests the lost Primarchs were already gone by the time of the raising of Monarchia in 964 M30, which would mean they disappeared either during or shortly after the Rangdan Xenocides ended. This is roughly consistent with the redacted events involving the Space Wolves in 965 M30 and 969 M30. So the timeline works, but just barely. Whatever happened to the Lost occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Rangdan threat being neutralised. What's particularly interesting is the long-term impact on the legions involved. The Dark Angels, who suffered the worst casualties, developed an obsession with secrets and hidden knowledge that would later manifest in the Fallen and their eternal hunt. The Space Wolves became associated with dirty work, executing missions that other legions couldn't or wouldn't, and the Ultramarines, possibly by absorbing survivors from the lost legions, grew to unprecedented size and prominence. It's as though the Rangdan Xenocides, and whatever happened to the lost in their wake, fundamentally transformed the character of the legions involved, creating fractures and secrets that would persist all the way to the Heresy and beyond. The Rangdan remain one of the most terrifying threats the Imperium has ever faced precisely because we know so little about them. They nearly destroyed humanity before the Imperium was even properly established. They killed Space Marines by the Legion full. They forced the Emperor himself to intervene directly on the battlefield. And somewhere in that nightmare, in those decades of existential struggle, the 2nd and 11th Legions fought and then disappeared from history. Whether their disappearance was consequence, coincidence, or something more deliberate remains one of the war's most carefully guarded secrets. But the connection is there, undeniable even if the exact nature of that connection remains frustratingly obscure. The Rangdan Xenocides represent the Imperium's first brush with possible extinction, a preview of the horrors that lurked in the galaxy waiting to consume humanity. They were a test of the Emperor's grand vision, a trial by fire that the Imperium passed only barely and at tremendous cost. And in the ashes of that conflict, 2 Primarchs and their legions were erased from history, their sacrifice or sin or failure deemed too terrible to acknowledge. Whatever the truth, it's buried somewhere in those burned-out sectors of the northern reaches, in the silent worlds cleansed by the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, in the archives that read only all data redacted. The Rangdan took more from the Imperium than just lives. They took memory itself, whole legions lost to the same void that swallowed the Xenos who killed them. When the Imperium needed someone killed, really killed, with no questions asked and absolute certainty of success, it called upon Leman Russ and his Space Wolves. This wasn't rumour or speculation. It was a recognised role, a dark duty that the 6th Legion performed throughout the Great Crusade. Understanding the Space Wolves' function as the Emperor's executioners is crucial to understanding what might have happened to the lost Primarchs, because if anyone would have been tasked with purging failed or treacherous brothers, it would have been the sons of Fenris. The concept of the space. Wolves as executioners isn't some fan theory or extrapolation. It's explicitly stated in multiple sources, referenced by characters within the fiction, and demonstrated through their actions across the heresy. Leman Russ himself viewed this role as central to his identity and purpose. He believed, perhaps correctly, that the Emperor had designed him and his legion to be the weapon turned against the Emperor's own warriors when necessary, the failsafe built into the Space Marine project to ensure that even superhuman soldiers could be brought to heel if they turned against their creator. The evidence for this role is extensive. In the novel Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, we get perhaps the most direct confirmation. The book follows Caspar Hauser, a human historian who becomes an advisor to the Space Wolves, and through his perspective we see how the Legion views itself. One of the most revealing moments comes in a conversation where Space Wolves discuss the possibility of Space Marines fighting Space Marines. The Wolves' response is telling. They indicate that such a thing wouldn't be unprecedented, that they had been called upon to sanction another Legion before. The phrasing is careful, deliberately vague, but the implication is clear. The Space Wolves had already been used against fellow Space Marines, and the likely candidates for such sanction would be the Lost Legions. Later in the same novel, as Leman Russ prepares to assault Prospero and destroy the Thousand Sons Legion, there's a moment of reflection where he contemplates his role as the Emperor's executioner. The text suggests that Russ found this duty burdensome, that it weighed on him heavily, but that he nevertheless accepted it as necessary. He viewed it as a grim obligation that came with his nature as what he perceived to be the most loyal and steadfast of the Emperor's sons. Where other Primarchs might question or refuse such orders, Russ would carry them out no matter how much it cost him personally. The circumstances around the confrontation with the Thousand Sons provide additional context. Russ was initially ordered by the Emperor to bring Magnus the Red back to Terra, to answer for his violation of the Edict of Nicaea. However, Horus, already fallen to chaos, convinced Russ to change those orders from capture to execution. Critically, Russ didn't question whether he was capable of destroying another legion. He simply attempted to do it. This suggests he'd had practice, that he'd done similar things before. Moreover, before the attack on Prospero, Russ tried to contact Magnus directly, attempting to get him to surrender peacefully. This is fascinating because it shows Russ didn't want to kill his brother, despite being willing to do so if necessary. He hoped for a bloodless solution, which raises the question, had he hoped for the same with the Lost? Or had their situations been different enough that no such hope was possible? There's another documented incident that demonstrates the Space Wolves' role as enforcers, the confrontation with Angron and the World Eaters. After the World Eaters massacred the entire population of the world of Gehenna in a frenzy of bloodlust, Russ was dispatched to bring them to heel. He engineered a confrontation where he challenged Angron to single combat, defeating the Red Angel in personal duel, but revealing that the entire World Eaters Legion was surrounded by the Space Wolves and would be annihilated if they didn't stand down. Angron, in his rage, refused to back off, and only Russ's restraint prevented a massacre. But the point was made, the Space Wolves could and would destroy another legion if ordered to do so. This incident is particularly relevant to the Lost Primarchs question, because it shows Russ attempting to educate a brother rather than simply killing him, trying to demonstrate that the World Eaters' behaviour was unacceptable without actually destroying them. Yet the willingness to destroy them if necessary was clear. What does this tell us about the Lost? If Russ tried diplomacy with Angron despite his reputation as the Emperor's attack dog, did he try similar approaches with the Lost Primarchs? Or were their sins different enough that no negotiation was possible? The novel Betrayer by Aaron Dembski-Bowden gives us Angron's perspective on the confrontation with the Space Wolves. Angron believed he'd won because he'd beaten Russ in single combat. Russ believed he'd won because he'd made his point and demonstrated the consequences of the World Eater's actions. But neither side actually wanted to fight to the death, which is notable. Russ genuinely seemed to care about his brothers, even the ones like Angron who were considered unstable. He tried to be the correcting hand rather than the executioner whenever possible. This paints a more complex picture of the Space Wolves' role. They weren't mindless killers. They were reluctant executioners who preferred not to have to kill at all. Yet, the title stuck. The Space Wolves were known throughout the legions as the Emperor's executioners, a reputation they cultivated even as they may have been ambivalent about it. Part of this was practical. If your enemies know you're willing and able to kill your own brothers, they're less likely to try you. It's deterrence through reputation, but part of it was also identity. The Space Wolves embraced their role as the ones willing to do what others wouldn't, to make the hard choices, to carry the burden of necessary violence against even fellow Space Marines. This reputation was reinforced by their role in the Rangdan Xenocides, where they participated in the brutal biopogroms that cleansed entire sectors. Alongside the Dark Angels, they systematically exterminated populations that had been enslaved by the Rangdan, killing millions of humans who could not be freed from Xenos control. This wasn't glorious conquest or enlightened liberation. It was ugly, genocidal work that scarred both legions. But it was also necessary from the Imperium's perspective, and the Space Wolves did it without complaint. They became associated with the dark necessities of the Crusade, with the violence that supported the Imperium's ideals but couldn't be directly acknowledged. There's an interesting detail from the Forge World Horus Heresy books that adds another dimension. In the chronological timeline of major events, 2 entries for 965.M30 and 969.M30 are completely redacted, listing only that the Space Wolves participated in those events. The timing is suggestive. The Rangdan Xenocides concluded around 900 M30. The Lost Primarchs are definitively gone by 964 M30, based on references during the raising of Monarchia. These redacted events fall right in that window when the Lost would have been purged. The fact that these specific entries are redacted, unlike other Space Wolves actions that are documented, strongly implies they relate to the Lost Legions. The Imperium has no problem acknowledging the Space Wolves fought orcs or humans, or even traitor Space Marines, but whatever they did in those 2 years is considered too sensitive to record even in Forge World's comprehensive black books. All of this circumstantial evidence points to the same conclusion. If the Lost Primarchs and their legions were destroyed or purged, the Space Wolves were almost certainly involved. They had the capability. Primarchs might be incredibly powerful, but they're not invincible, and a concentrated assault by an entire legion under Leman Russ would be sufficient to kill even another Primarch, especially if supported by Custodes and potentially the Emperor himself. They had the reputation and role. This is what the Emperor used them for, and they were active at the right time in the right place, with their activities deliberately censored from records. But here's where it gets more complicated. Aaron Dembski-Bowden, one of Black Library's most prominent authors, and the man who's written extensively about the Space Wolves, has stated directly that the Space Wolves didn't kill the Lost Primarchs. In a Reddit thread from 2018, he explicitly said that claiming the Wolves killed them would be giving an answer, and there's not allowed to be an answer to this question. This statement is important because it comes from an author with inside knowledge of Games Workshop's editorial policy. If he says there's not supposed to be an answer, we can trust that Games Workshop has deliberately structured their storytelling to maintain the mystery. So how do we reconcile the strong evidence that the Space Wolves were involved with the authorial statement that they didn't kill the Lost Primarchs? There are several possibilities. First, involvement doesn't necessarily mean direct killing. The Space Wolves might have been there, might have participated in the sanction, without being the ones who actually struck the killing blow. Perhaps the Emperor himself did the deed, with the Space Wolves serving as enforcers and witnesses. Perhaps Malcador had a role, using his psychic powers to contain or neutralize the Lost Primarchs without violence. Perhaps there were Custodes involved, the Emperor's most trusted bodyguards carrying out the ultimate sanction. Second, the Lost Primarchs might not be dead at all. Killing them is only one interpretation of their erasure. They could have been imprisoned somewhere, sealed away in stasis or locked in the darkest dungeons of the Imperial Palace. They could have been exiled, sent beyond the boundaries of known space with orders never to return. They could have been mind-wiped themselves, their identities destroyed even if their bodies survived. The Space Wolves' role might have been capture and containment rather than execution, turning executioner into a more metaphorical title. Third, it's possible that one lost Primarch was killed by the Space Wolves while the other met a different fate. If one fell in the Rangdan Xenocides through enemy action, while the other was purged by the Space Wolves later, that would explain both the evidence of Space Wolves' involvement and the author's insistence that there's not a single simple answer. Multiple fates for multiple Primarchs would preserve the ambiguity while allowing for various interpretations. Fourth, and perhaps most intriguingly, the Space Wolves' involvement might have been psychological rather than physical. Leman Russ was known for his attempts to educate his brothers, to force them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their actions. Maybe his role in the Lost Primarch's fate was to break them psychologically, to make them realise the enormity of whatever they'd done, to be the conscience that drove them to accept their own erasia. If the Lost Primarchs volunteered for obliteration, if they asked to be destroyed rather than continue existing with the shame or corruption they carried, the Space Wolves might have simply witnessed and enforced their wishes rather than imposing sentence from above. What we can say with confidence is that the Space Wolves were designed, trained, and used as the Imperium's final sanction against its own warriors. They were the legion you called when everyone else had failed, when the situation was beyond diplomacy or rehabilitation, when the only solution was overwhelming force applied with absolute certainty. They took no pleasure in this role, but they didn't shirk from it either. Leman Russ saw himself as the son who would do what his father needed, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it cost his legion in blood and reputation. The Lost Primarchs, whatever their fate, almost certainly encountered the Space Wolves in their final days. Whether those encounters ended in battle, imprisonment, erasure, or something else entirely remains part of the mystery. But the shadow of the wolves hangs over the empty plinths, a reminder that even the Emperor's sons were not beyond sanction, that even family could be unmade if the Imperium demanded it. The Space Wolves carried that burden through the Great Crusade and into the Heresy, performing ugly necessities so others wouldn't have to, killing brothers so humanity could live. It's a grim legacy, and one that helps explain why the fate of the lost is so carefully hidden. Some violence is too necessary, too terrible, too fundamentally at odds with the Imperium's self-image to ever be fully acknowledged. When we discuss the Lost Primarchs, we often focus on the Gene Fathers themselves, the magnificent demigods who disappeared from history. But what about their sons, the Space Marines who served under them? These were tens of thousands of warriors, each a superhuman killer, each psychologically and physiologically bonded to their Primarch through shared gene seed. What happens when that bond is severed? When the father is erased, what becomes of the children? The evidence suggests something both pragmatic and tragic. The Space Marines of the Lost Legions were not destroyed alongside their Primarchs. Instead, they were repurposed, their minds wiped, their histories erased, their gene bonds severed or suppressed, and then integrated into other legions. They survived, but they survived as different men, their identities as members of the 2nd or 11th Legion burned away, leaving only the raw material of Astarte's warriors to be remoulded into new forms. This revelation comes most explicitly from the audio drama The Sigillite, where Malcador explains to Rogel Dawn what happened after the Lost Primarchs were eliminated. He states clearly that the Space Marines of those legions did not share their Primarch's fate. They were too valuable as military assets, too costly to simply discard, their gene seed too rare and precious to waste. Instead, they were mind-wiped and attuned to new circumstances. This euphemistic phrasing suggests a process of psychological reconditioning, potentially combined with psychic manipulation, that stripped away their memories and identities as members of the Lost Legions and prepared them for incorporation into other forces. The mind wiping itself would have been a significant undertaking. Space Marines are incredibly resistant to conventional forms of brainwashing or psychological manipulation. Their training includes resistance to interrogation. Their enhanced physiology makes many drugs ineffective, and their fundamental mental architecture is different from baseline humans. To thoroughly erase their memories of their Primarchs, their Legion identities, and their previous service would require either extremely sophisticated technology or more likely direct psychic intervention. Given that Malcador was one of the most powerful psychers in the Imperium, second only to the Emperor himself, it's reasonable to assume he personally oversaw or conducted this process. The same psychic might that could suppress the memories of the remaining Primarchs could certainly wipe the minds of mere Space Marines, however powerful they might be. The question then becomes, where did they go? The most commonly cited theory, supported by evidence in The First Heretic, is that the majority were absorbed into the Ultramarines. During a conversation between word-bearers, one character notes that the 13th Legion swelled to eclipse all other legions around the same time the 2nd and 11th were forgotten. This isn't presented as established fact, but as a rumour that circulates among those who pay attention to such things, which is exactly what you'd expect if the truth were being actively suppressed, but wasn't quite completely hidden. The numbers support this theory. Most legions numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 astartes at their peak strength. The Ultramarines, by contrast, grew to over 250,000 warriors, dwarfing every other legion by a significant margin. Robert Guilliman's explanation for this was that Ultramar, his personal empire of 500 worlds, was uniquely efficient at recruiting, training and producing new Space Marines, and this was probably partly true. Guilliman was perhaps the most administratively gifted of all the Primarchs, and Ultramar was genuinely better organised than most Imperial territories, but the scale of the difference is striking. Even accounting for Ultramar's advantages, growing to nearly double the size of the next largest legion seems excessive. However, if you add in the remnants of two other legions, each perhaps numbering 50 to 80,000 before their Primarchs fell, suddenly the numbers make perfect sense. The Ultramarines' unprecedented size could be explained by them serving as the repository for Space Marines, who could no longer serve under their own banners, warriors whose gene seed was still viable even if their Primarchs were not. There's a certain cruel logic to choosing the Ultramarines as the destination for these orphaned warriors. First, Guilliman's Legion was known for its versatility and organisation. If you were going to integrate large numbers of Space Marines from different Legion cultures, the Ultramarines had the administrative framework and doctrinal flexibility to handle it. Second, Guilliman himself was involved in requesting the memory wipes that would hide the lost Primarch's fate from the other Primarchs. His direct involvement suggests he took responsibility for the aftermath, accepting the burden of adopting these warriors because he felt some obligation to them or their lost fathers. Third, Ultramar's huge recruiting base would help dilute the influence of the new arrivals. Adding 50,000 warriors with different combat doctrines to a legion of 100,000 might cause problems. Adding them to a legion already approaching 200,000 makes them a minority that can be more easily assimilated. But the Ultramarines weren't the only possibility. There's evidence, though less explicit, that the Imperial Fists might also have taken in some of the Lost Legion's Space Marines. Rogel Dawn was the other Primarch who specifically requested the memory wipes. His personal involvement, like Guilliman's, suggests a connection to what happened. Perhaps Dawn commanded the forces that carried out the sanction, or perhaps he was close to one of the lost Primarchs and felt responsible for their fall. Whatever the reason, taking in some of their orphaned sons would fit with Dawn's character as someone who accepted burdens and responsibilities without complaint. The Imperial Fist's own numbers and organisational structure would have made absorbing additional warriors feasible, though probably not on the scale of the Ultramarines. The psychological impact on these mind-wiped warriors would have been severe even if they consciously remembered nothing. Space Marines are psychically linked to their Primarchs through their gene seed. They feel their father's presence draw strength from his existence, and are shaped by his personality in ways both subtle and overt. To have that link severed, to have the central anchoring point of your identity removed, would create a fundamental void in your psyche, even if you didn't remember what was missing. You might wake up one day as an Ultramarine or an Imperial Fist, with implanted memories of recruitment from Macragge or Inuit, with tactical doctrines and combat experiences that feel like they're yours, but somewhere deep in your subconscious there would be echoes of something else, phantom sensations of a different father, ghost memories of battles fought under different banners, a sense that something fundamental about your identity doesn't quite fit together properly. These warriors would have been haunted men, even if they could never articulate what haunted them. There's also the question of gene seed incompatibility. Space Marines are created using gene seed derived from their Primarch's genetic template. Each Primarch's gene seed is slightly different, carrying unique traits and potential flaws. In theory, you can't simply transplant gene seed from one legion to another. The rejection would be catastrophic. But we know that Space Marines from the Lost Legions were integrated into other legions, which suggests either that their gene seed was particularly compatible with the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, or that sophisticated gene manipulation techniques were employed to make the integration possible. One possibility is that they didn't actually change gene seed at all. The warriors from the Lost Legions might have retained their original gene seed, even as they were mind-wiped and assigned to new legions. They would be Ultramarines or Imperial Fists in training, doctrine and belief, but biologically, they would still be sons of the 2nd or 11th. This would be a carefully guarded secret, known only to the highest levels of command and to the Primarchs who accepted these warriors into their legions. It would also mean that successor chapters descended from the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists might unknowingly carry the gene seed of the lost Primarchs, a hidden legacy that persists to the present day of the 41st millennium. The alternative is that the mind-wiping was accompanied by surgical gene seed replacement, an incredibly risky procedure that would require removing the warrior's original progenoid glands and implanting new ones derived from their adoptive Primarch. This would be hellishly painful and dangerous, with high mortality rates, but it would ensure complete biological integration into the new legion. The fact that Malcador specifically mentioned the warriors did not share their Primarch's fate suggests most survived the integration process, which argues against extensive surgical intervention. But perhaps a hybrid approach was used, with some warriors undergoing gene seed replacement, while others retained their original biology under deep cover. There's one more disturbing implication to consider. If the Space Marines from the Lost Legions were mind-wiped and integrated into other legions, what happened to their gene seed tithes? Every Space Marine legion was required to regularly send samples of their gene seed back to Terra to maintain stockpiles for future recruitment. These tithes would be stored in the vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, carefully catalogued and preserved. When the Lost Legions were expunged, what happened to those stockpiles? Were they destroyed to ensure no one could ever recreate the Lost Primarch's genetic lines? Or were they quietly relabelled, renamed, and attributed to other Primarchs to hide their true origin? If the latter, it creates a possibility both intriguing and horrifying. Successor chapters in the 41st millennium often don't know with certainty which Primarch's gene seed they carry. Records have been lost, archives corrupted, histories deliberately falsified. Some chapters are of uncertain founding, their genetic heritage unclear. What if some of these chapters, believing themselves to be descended from Leman or Dawn, or one of the other known Primarchs, actually carry the gene seed of the lost Primarchs? What if the Emperor's failed sons have spiritual children scattered across the Imperium, their legacy hidden in plain sight? This isn't just speculation. There are canonical chapters whose gene seed lineage is questionable. The Bloodravens, prominently featured in the Dawn of War video games, have unknown origins and exhibit psychic abilities that don't quite match any known Primarch's traits. Fans have long theorized they might be descended from one of the Lost Legions, though this has never been confirmed and almost certainly never will be. The Minotaurs, a brutal chapter that specialises in fighting other Space Marines, have similarly unclear origins and access to incredible resources. Could they be Lost Legion descendants, unconsciously perpetuating their forgotten fathers' roles? We'll never know for certain, but the possibility adds another layer of tragedy to the story. The lost Primarchs were erased, but their children may have survived, unknowing their heritage hidden even from themselves. The fate of the Lost Legion's Space Marines represents the Imperium at its most pragmatic and its most cruel. Rather than waste precious gene-forged warriors, they were stripped of everything that made them who they were and repurposed into useful tools. It was efficient, it was ruthless, and it was probably the most compassionate option available given the alternatives. These warriors didn't choose their Primarch's sins, whatever those sins were. They were simply soldiers following orders, and when their commanders were removed, they were granted a second chance at service, even if that chance required destroying their original identities. But mercy and cruelty are often intertwined in the Imperium. Was it kinder to mind-wipe these warriors and give them new lives, or would it have been more honourable to let them die with their Primarchs, maintaining their identities and loyalties to the end? We can't ask them. They don't remember being asked. They don't remember anything at all about what they were before. They are Space Marines of the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists or whichever legions took them in, and if sometimes they wake from dreams they can't quite remember, dreams of different colours and different commanders and different names, well, such things are easily dismissed as the mind's tricks, artefacts of stress or exhaustion, nothing more. The Lost Legions live on, after a fashion, scattered and diluted and hidden, their gene seed flowing through bloodlines that bear other names, their warriors fighting for an Imperium that has forgotten they ever existed. It's a strange kind of immortality, this erasia that nevertheless leaves traces, this death that doesn't quite kill. And perhaps that's the most fitting memorial the Forgotten and the Purged could have received. Not grand monuments or epic remembrances, but quiet, unknowing persistence. Shadows cast by absences, identities dissolved but somehow still influencing the shape of the Imperium they helped to build and which destroyed them. Now that we've examined all the concrete evidence, or at least all the evidence that can be teased from decades of carefully ambiguous lore, it's time to delve into the realm of speculation. The Lost Primarchs exist in a unique narrative space. They're canonical, their absence is confirmed and significant, but their stories are deliberately left blank. This has led to an explosion of theories from fans, each attempting to fill in the gaps with explanations that fit the available evidence while addressing why their erasure was necessary. These theories range from the plausible to the outlandish, from the tragic to the darkly comedic, and collectively they represent the community's attempt to solve an intentionally unsolvable mystery. Let's start with perhaps the most straightforward theory, early chaos corruption. This theory suggests that one or both of the Lost Primarchs were exposed to chaos influence early in the Great Crusade, and began to fall to the ruinous powers well before Horus's betrayal. Given that chaos had scattered the Primarchs in infancy specifically to corrupt them, it's not unreasonable to think they might have succeeded with a couple of them before the Emperor could fortify their minds and souls against such influence. If a Primarch began manifesting signs of chaos taint, building demonic shrines, allowing his legion to indulge in warp sorcery, or exhibiting mutation and degeneration, the Emperor would face an existential crisis. Acknowledge the corruption, and you validate the existence of chaos at a time when the Imperial truth denies such things exist. Fight the corrupted Primarch publicly, and you risk his followers spreading the taint to other legions. The only solution would be swift, silent destruction, followed by absolute suppression of all records. The problem with this theory is that it doesn't quite match the emotional responses we see from the other Primarchs. When they discuss the lost, it's with sadness and regret, not the burning hatred they reserve for the actual traitors. Sanguinius's fear about the Blood Angels being erased suggests he thinks gene seed corruption, not chaos taint, was the issue. If the Lost had fallen to chaos, the other Primarchs would likely view them as they later viewed Horus and his followers, as enemies to be destroyed, not lost brothers to be mourned. Still, early chaos exposure could have been one component of a more complex situation. Perhaps one Primarch was corrupted while the other faced a different fate, allowing for both sets of emotional responses. Another popular theory centres on gene seed degradation or catastrophic mutation. We know from Sanguinius's comments that gene seed flaws could lead to erasia. The Blood Angels suffered from the Red Thirst, a genetic flaw that made them bloodthirsty berserkers. The Space Wolves had the curse of the Wolfen, warriors who devolved into bestial forms. The Thousand Sons faced rampant mutation before Magnus made his pact with Tzeentch. Most of these flaws could be managed, hidden, or at least contained by sufficiently powerful Primarchs. But what if the 2nd or 11th Legion's gene seed degradation was unmanageable? What if their Space Marines were degenerating into monsters en masse, turning into creatures that couldn't be controlled or hidden? What if the Primarchs themselves were beginning to physically or mentally degenerate? From the Emperor's perspective, a legion with terminal gene seed instability would be worse than a legion that turned traitor. Traitors can be fought and defeated. A degrading gene line is a ticking time bomb that could contaminate the entire Space Marine project if left unchecked. If other legions saw that Primarch gene seed could fail catastrophically, they might begin to question their own genetic stability. If recruiting worlds learned that Space Marines could devolve into monsters, recruitment would become infinitely harder. The solution would be to erase the problem entirely before it could spread panic or despair through the Imperium's military forces, destroy the degrading legion, mind-wipe the survivors, and suppress all records so no one would ever know that the Emperor's genetic engineering could fail so catastrophically. This theory has the advantage of matching Sanguinius's fears and explaining why the gene seed of the Lost Legions might have been salvageable through integration into other legions. If the problem was with specific combinations of genes or environmental triggers specific to those Primarchs and their recruiting worlds, separating the Space Marines from their Primarchs and relocating them might halt or slow the degradation. It also explains why the Emperor would have kept the Space Marines alive, rather than destroying them with their Primarchs. If the core gene seed was still viable under the right circumstances, it would be wasteful not to preserve it. A third theory suggests xeno-sympathy or attempted alliance with aliens. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor's stance on Xenos was absolute. Humanity could not and would not coexist with alien species. All non-humans were to be destroyed or driven from the galaxy to make room for mankind's manifest destiny. This was non-negotiable dogma, and any dissent was considered heresy. But what if one of the Lost Primarchs disagreed? What if he encountered a Xenos species that was clearly intelligent, perhaps even benevolent, and tried to negotiate with them rather than exterminating them? What if he attempted to integrate alien technology into his legion, or even recruit Xenos auxiliaries? Such actions would be absolutely unforgivable to the Emperor. Worse, they would represent an ideological challenge to the fundamental premises of the Great Crusade. If one Primarch could make peace with Xenos, others might ask why they couldn't do the same. The entire genocidal engine of the Crusade would grind to a halt as legions began questioning whether every alien species really needed to be destroyed. From the Emperor's perspective, a xeno-sympathizer would be more dangerous than a chaos cultist, because he would be appealing to rationality and mercy rather than to forbidden powers. He would be attacking the moral framework of the Crusade itself. The Rangdan Xenocides provide a potential context for this theory. If one of the Lost Primarchs tried to negotiate with the Rangdan rather than destroying them, if he attempted to understand their technology or integrate their human slave populations peacefully, it would explain the urgent need for his destruction. The Rangdan were existential threats. Any attempt to deal with them diplomatically would be catastrophic. The Emperor would need to eliminate the dissenting Primarch quickly before other Primarchs learned about the attempt and began questioning the no-negotiation policy. This would also explain why the Space Wolves, Known xenophobes who relished killing aliens were trusted with the sanction. They would have no sympathy for a xeno-lover and would execute orders without the risk of being swayed by arguments about alien rights or coexistence. A variation on this theory suggests that one lost Primarch might have been culturally or philosophically too different from the Emperor's vision. Perhaps his homeworld raised him with values fundamentally incompatible with the Imperium. Maybe he was a passionate advocate for democracy, a genuine believer in religious freedom, a supporter of abhumans or mutants, or someone who thought conquered worlds should retain autonomy rather than being absorbed into the Imperium. Such views wouldn't make him a traitor in the traditional sense, but they would make him a constant source of friction and ideological contamination. If he kept advocating for his positions, kept trying to implement alternative models of governance, kept challenging the Emperor's autocratic vision, there would come a point where he'd have to be removed, not because he'd done something unforgivable, but because he represented a future the Emperor couldn't allow. This theory has the advantage of explaining the sadness the other Primarchs feel. If one of the Lost was genuinely well-intentioned, genuinely trying to make the Imperium better according to his lights, his erasure would be tragic rather than satisfying. His brothers might have liked him personally, respected his ideals even if they didn't share them, and mourned his removal as a waste of potential rather than the punishment of a villain. It would also explain why the memory had to be suppressed. If the other Primarchs remembered a brother being destroyed for advocating mercy or freedom, they might start to question the Emperor's vision themselves. There's also the perennially popular theory of catastrophic military failure. Maybe one of the lost Primarchs led his legion into a trap and lost them all, or failed to conquer a world despite superior numbers, or retreated when he should have fought. Military incompetence wouldn't normally warrant erasure, but if the failure was spectacular enough, if it called into question the entire concept of Primarch infallibility, the Emperor might decide that acknowledging it would do more harm than pretending it never happened. This theory is less popular among fans because it seems wasteful. Why destroy a Primarch and his legion over a single military defeat? But combined with other factors like gene seed instability revealed during the stressful failure, or mutiny by the Primarch's own sons after the defeat, it could contribute to the overall picture. One of the more creative theories suggests that one or both lost Primarchs were female, or at least not male in the way the other Primarchs were. All the known Primarchs present as masculine, embodying various aspects of male warrior archetypes. But the Emperor created 20. Perhaps he experimented with different expressions of leadership and warfare. If one Primarch was female or existed outside traditional gender categories, and if that Primarch's cultural context didn't accommodate that reality well, there could have been complications. This theory is more about real-world diversity considerations than fitting the in-universe evidence. But it's worth mentioning because it highlights how little we actually know. We assume the lost Primarchs were like their brothers because we haven't been told otherwise, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Another theory focuses on the timing, and suggests that one lost Primarch might simply have died in a particularly unfortunate or embarrassing way. Not in glorious combat, but perhaps to a disease, an accident, a mistake, or simple bad luck. An infant Primarch wandering into a volcanic eruption before he could develop enough to survive it. A young Primarch consumed by the apex predator of his world before he could conquer it. A mature Primarch killed by something as mundane as a poisoned blade or structural collapse. The idea that Primarchs could die to such ordinary threats would shatter the myth of their invincibility, so the Emperor might have decided it was better to pretend that Primarch never existed, rather than admit one of his sons died like a common mortal. This theory is less satisfying narratively, but it has a certain tragic realism to it. There's also speculation about the lost Primarchs being too successful, or successful in the wrong ways. What if one of them conquered his homeworld too thoroughly, building an empire so powerful and independent that it could rival the Imperium itself? What if he was so beloved by his people that they would follow him over the Emperor, creating a potential schism? The Emperor needed sons who were loyal and effective, but maybe one was effective enough to become a threat. Rather than risk a civil war or allow a competing power center to exist, the Emperor might have preemptively struck, destroying the threat before it could fully mature. This theory fits poorly with the grief the other Primarchs express, unless they genuinely like their successful brother and saw his punishment as unjust. Perhaps the darkest theory suggests that the lost Primarchs were experiments that the Emperor deliberately failed. What if he created one or two of them with specific traits he wanted to test, knowing they would fail, planning to erase them all along? Maybe one was designed to be easily corruptible by chaos so the Emperor could study how corruption spreads and develop countermeasures. Maybe another was given gene seed deliberately flawed so the Emperor could see how Primarchs would handle. Biological degradation. If this were true, the lost Primarchs would be martyrs to the Emperor's cold pragmatism, sacrificed from their moment of creation to serve his greater plans. Their brothers, if they ever learned the truth, would be horrified, which might explain why Dorn and Guilliman specifically wanted that knowledge suppressed. One theory that's gained traction suggests that the two lost Primarchs had opposite but equally unacceptable fates. One was too peaceful, refusing to wage war or prosecute the genocidal campaigns the Crusade required, becoming a pacifist or advocating for diplomacy over violence. The other was too violent, even by the Imperium's brutal standards, conducting atrocities so extreme that even the Emperor found them excessive. Both would need to be removed, but for opposite reasons, which would create the complex mixture of emotions we see in the other Primarchs' responses. Some would mourn the peaceful brother's death as the loss of conscience. Others would regret the violent brother's erasure as waste of potential. Neither group could speak freely about their feelings, because both would be implicitly criticizing the Emperor's judgment. Finally, there's the meta-theory that deliberately engages with the real-world reasons for the Lost Primarch's existence. Rick Priestley, co-creator of Warhammer 40,000, has stated explicitly that he created the Lost Legions to provide mystery and depth to the setting, to create unsolvable enigmas that would fuel speculation and imagination. He wanted the Horus Heresy to feel like a mythological event viewed from distance, where some truths had been lost to time, where not everything could be explained or understood. The Lost Primarchs serve this narrative purpose beautifully. They're gaps that make the world feel larger and more complex than what's shown on the page. From this perspective, every theory is simultaneously right and wrong. The Lost Primarchs are whatever you need them to be for your personal engagement with the setting. They're a space for creative interpretation, a void that each fan can fill with their own ideas about what went wrong and why. Games Workshop will never provide definitive answers, because doing so would destroy the mystery's value. Aaron Dembski-Bowden confirmed this in his Reddit statement. There's not allowed to be an answer because the absence of an answer is the point. Yet even within this meta-awareness, certain theories are more plausible than others based on the evidence. Geneseed catastrophe fits Sanguinius's fear. Rangdan corruption aligns with the timeline. Space Wolves as executioners make sense given their documented role. Ideological differences resonate with the sadness in other Primarchs' comments. Each theory captures some aspect of the truth, even as the complete truth remains deliberately beyond reach. And perhaps that's appropriate. In a universe as dark and cynical as Warhammer 40,000, where knowledge is dangerous and truth is often lethal, some secrets should remain secrets. Some brothers should remain lost. Some failures should stay forgotten. Not because remembering would be impossible, but because forgetting is easier, safer, and ultimately more merciful than confronting the terrible reality of what was done and why it had to be done. One of the most telling aspects of the Lost Primarchs' mystery isn't what we're told directly, but how the surviving Primarchs react when the topic arises. These reactions, carefully written into novels and short stories, provide crucial insight into what kind of fates befell the Second and 11th. The emotional resonance is consistent across sources, not hatred, not dismissal, but a profound, haunted sadness mixed with something that might be fear or guilt, or both. Consider Sanguinius's statement in Fear to Tread. when he expresses his terror that the Blood Angels might be erased like the Lost Legions. He doesn't speak with contempt about failures, or with righteous anger about traitors. He speaks with dread, as though what happened to his lost brothers is a fate worse than death, worse than dishonour, worse even than damnation. "I will not have a third empty plinth," he says, and in that moment we understand that he knows, or at least suspects, exactly what leads to those empty plinths. And whatever that knowledge is, it terrifies him enough that he's willing to hide the red thirst from his father, to carry that burden in secret rather than risk the Emperor making the same decision about the Blood Angels that he made about the 2nd and 11th. What does Sanguinius's fear tell us? First, that he believes his legion could be destroyed not for betrayal, but for inherent flaws beyond their control. Second, that erasure is a known option, a precedent that's been set. Third, that the decision to erase a legion is made at the highest level, probably by the Emperor himself, and cannot be appealed or reversed. Fourth, that whatever happened to the Lost was terrible enough that Sanguinius, perhaps the most noble and beloved of all Primarchs, would rather live with potentially catastrophic genetic instability than face the same fate. This is a Primarch who would later sacrifice himself facing Horus, who faced death with dignity and courage. Yet the thought of being erased, of having his legion struck from history, fills him with such horror that he'll conceal critical information from his father. Magnus the Red also reacts to the Lost with evident discomfort. In 1,000 Suns, when he starts to reference a time when more Primarchs were gathered together, Mortarion immediately cuts him off and reminds him that the Emperor forbade discussion of it. Magnus drops the subject instantly. This is significant because Magnus is characterized as curious, intellectually brave, and willing to push boundaries. He's not someone who normally backs down from uncomfortable topics, yet even he won't directly discuss the Lost Primarchs when reminded of the prohibition. What could make even Magnus the Red fall silent? The answer is probably that Magnus, like Sanguinius, understands that what happened to the Lost could happen to his own legion. The 1,000 Suns struggled with rampant mutation, their gene seed destabilizing, their warriors transforming into monsters despite their best efforts. Magnus made a pact with Tzeentch to save his legion from this fate, but before that pact, he must have lived in constant fear that the Emperor would deem the 1,000 Suns too corrupted to continue. He would have looked at the empty plinths and seen his own potential future. No wonder he doesn't want to discuss it. No wonder Mortarion can shut him down with a simple reminder. They all know that the Emperor's judgment once passed is absolute. Mortarion's own reaction is interesting. He's the one who enforces the prohibition against discussing the Lost, suggesting he either participated in their erasure or holds strong opinions about the necessity of silence. Mortarion is practical, grim, and unsentimental. If he thinks the topic needs to be forbidden, it's not because he's squeamish, but because he recognizes a genuine threat. Perhaps he understands that discussing the Lost would raise questions that could undermine Legion unity. Perhaps he personally witnessed what happened and carries that memory as a burden. Or perhaps he's simply more loyal to the Emperor's edicts than his brothers, willing to enforce uncomfortable silences because the Emperor demanded them. Then there's the revelation from the Sigillite that Rogel Dawn and Rabut Guilliman specifically requested that Malcador suppress the other Primarchs' memories. This is extraordinary for several reasons. First, it means they had those memories, at least initially. They knew their lost brothers personally. They remembered what happened. Second, they deemed that knowledge so dangerous, so potentially damaging to the Great Crusade, that they asked for it to be forcibly removed not just from themselves, but from all their brothers. Third, and most significantly, this suggests that what happened was objectively terrible even by the standards of the Primarchs, beings who had seen entire worlds burned and armies annihilated. Dawn and Guilliman are in many ways the most stable and rational of the Primarchs. Dawn is stolid, practical, unflinchingly honest. Guilliman is brilliant, organised, dedicated to efficiency and optimal outcomes. neither is prone to emotional overreaction or unnecessary drama. If they believe memories need to be suppressed, it's because they've made a careful calculation that the memories do more harm than good. What could meet that threshold? The most likely answer is that whatever happened to the lost Primarchs threatened the fundamental premise of the Great Crusade. If the other Primarchs fully remembered that one of their brothers was destroyed for being too merciful, or that another was erased because his gene seed degraded, or that both fell to corruption that none of them saw coming, it would create cracks in their faith in the Emperor and in each other. They would start questioning whether any of them were truly safe, whether the Emperor really valued them as sons or merely as tools. They would begin to doubt their own perfection, their own permanence. The psychological impact could have fragmented the Primarchs' brotherhood at a time when unity was crucial. So Dorn and Guilliman, thinking strategically, decided it would be better to forget. Better to have grief without context than to have understanding that breeds doubt. Better to wonder about lost brothers than to remember exactly how they were lost and realise it could happen to you. It's a brutal calculation, but it's the kind of calculation these two Primarchs were designed to make. They carried the burden of knowledge so their brothers wouldn't have to. They remembered so others could forget. And presumably, they had their own memories suppressed afterward, leaving only Malcador and perhaps the Emperor himself as keepers of the truth. This also explains why the suppression was psychic rather than simply commanding silence. You can order someone not to speak about something, but you can't order them not to think about it, not to let it colour their actions and choices. The memories had to be removed or buried so deeply that they couldn't influence behaviour. The Primarchs needed to believe, genuinely believe, that their brotherhood was more or less whole, that the Emperor's plan was proceeding smoothly, that they were part of something perfect and eternal. The cracks had to be plastered over so thoroughly that you couldn't see them even when looking directly at them. But memory suppression isn't perfect, especially when dealing with beings as powerful and psych-active as Primarchs. Throughout the Horus Heresy novels, we see moments where Primarchs almost remember something, where they feel a presence missing, where they count brothers and come up short without quite understanding why. The suppression leaves ghosts, emotional residue without content. They know something is wrong, something is missing, but they can't quite grasp what it is. And that ambiguous discomfort might be worse than concrete grief because it creates a pervasive unease that can never be resolved or addressed. The sadness the Primarchs express isn't just about losing brothers. It's about losing the certainty that their brotherhood was inviolable, that their places were secure, that the Emperor's love was unconditional. The lost Primarchs represent proof that even the Emperor's gene sons can fail, can be judged unworthy, can be removed from the board. They represent the possibility that none of the others are truly safe, that any of them could be next if they step too far out of line or encounter bad enough luck. They represent the fundamental precarity beneath all the confidence and power and genetic superiority. This is why the topic is taboo, why even after the memory suppression there's a lingering prohibition against discussion. Some truths are too corrosive to acknowledge, some realities too threatening to accept. Better to maintain the fiction, however thin, that the brotherhood of Primarchs is complete and eternal, that the Emperor's plan is perfect and unchanging. Better to mourn empty plinths than to admit what those empty spaces really mean about the Imperium, the Emperor, and the Primarchs themselves. The emotional weight of the lost Primarchs is, paradoxically, what makes them most present in the narrative. Their absence is heavy, tangible, pressing down on every scene where the Primarchs gather. You can feel the missing persons in the room, the conversations that aren't happening, the bonds that should exist but don't, the grief without object, the fear without clear source. And perhaps that's the most fitting memorial for the forgotten and the purged, not statues or monuments, but the permanent psychic scars left by their removal, the wounds in the fabric of the Primarch brotherhood that never quite heal, the names never spoken that nevertheless echo in every silence. At this point in our exploration, we need to step outside the fiction entirely. and address the real-world reasons for the Lost Primarchs' mysterious nature. Understanding Games Workshop's design philosophy helps explain why this particular mystery will never be solved, why it's fundamentally different from other unresolved plot threads, and why that's not only intentional, but essential to its narrative function. Rick Priestley, who co-created Warhammer 40,000 alongside Brian Ansell, has been remarkably forthcoming about his original intentions. In interviews over the years, he's explained that he created the Lost Legions deliberately to give the setting deep background and unknowable 10,000-year-old mysteries, creating questions for which there could be no answer. This wasn't accidental or the result of poor planning. It was a conscious artistic choice to leave certain elements unresolved, allowing the Horus Heresy to feel like a mythological event viewed from vast historical distance, where some truths had been lost to time and the erosion of records. For years, the fandom believed that the Lost Legions existed primarily to allow players to create their own homebrew Space Marine chapters, or legions, giving them a canonical hook to justify their original creations by claiming descent from one of the mysterious missing Primarchs. Priestley himself has addressed this misconception directly, pointing out that he created 1,000 chapters specifically for that purpose. The Lost Legion served a different function. They were meant to be gaps in knowledge, permanent question marks, mysteries that enriched the setting precisely because they couldn't be answered. This concept has a formal name in literary and game studies, invitational incompleteness. The term was coined by philosopher Nathan Wildman to describe fictional worlds that deliberately leave certain elements undefined, inviting audiences to fill in those gaps with their own imagination and interpretations. Unlike accidental plot holes or simply undeveloped elements, invitational incompleteness is a conscious design choice that makes the fiction more engaging by acknowledging that some things should remain mysterious. The Lost Primarchs represent perhaps the purest example of invitational incompleteness in all of Warhammer 40,000. They're confirmed to exist within the setting's continuity. Their absence is significant and noted by characters within the fiction. There are just enough hints and clues to fuel speculation, but there will never be, can never be, a definitive answer to what happened to them. Any attempt to provide such an answer would destroy the very thing that makes them interesting. Aaron Dembski-Bowden, one of Black Library's most prominent and accomplished authors, has confirmed this editorial policy explicitly. In a 2018 Reddit thread, when asked whether the Space Wolves killed the Lost Primarchs, he stated, "That would be an answer, and there's not allowed to be an answer." This isn't him being coy or teasing future revelations. It's a straightforward acknowledgement of Games Workshop's firm policy. The Lost Primarchs' fate will remain permanently undetermined because that's the entire point of their existence in the narrative. Why is this policy so important? Several reasons, each building on the others to create a web of justifications. First, maintaining mystery preserves the sense of scope and depth in the setting. If everything in Warhammer 40,000 were explained, catalogued and resolved, the universe would feel smaller, more contained, less like an actual galaxy with genuine history, and more like a tabletop game with defined boundaries. The Lost Primarchs remind us that there are things we don't know, that history has eroded some truths beyond recovery, that the Imperium contains secrets even it doesn't fully understand. This makes the setting feel more real, more lived in, more genuinely vast. Second, mystery creates engagement. Fans have been debating what happened to the Lost Primarchs for over 30 years, generating countless forum threads, YouTube videos, fan fiction pieces, and artistic interpretations. Each new piece of official lore is examined for hints about the Lost. Every Primarch statement about missing brothers is analysed for clues. This ongoing conversation keeps the community engaged with the setting even between major releases, creating a discourse that extends far beyond simple consumption of official products. If Games Workshop revealed the answer tomorrow, a huge portion of this engagement would evaporate overnight, replaced briefly by a spike of discussion about the revelation and then declining as the mystery converted into mere trivia. Third, preserving ambiguity allows multiple interpretations to coexist. One fan might believe the lost Primarchs fell to gene-seed corruption, another that they were too peaceful for the Crusades' demands, a third that they attempted xeno-integration. Each interpretation enriches that fan's personal understanding of the setting, influencing how they build their armies, write their stories, or engage with the games. If Games Workshop declared one interpretation canon, it would invalidate all the others, telling countless fans that their years of thinking about the Lost Primarchs were based on incorrect assumptions. That's not just disappointing, it's actively hostile to fan investment. Fourth, answering the question would limit future storytelling possibilities. As long as the Lost Primarchs remain undefined, they can't contradict future plot developments. They're a permanent wild card, a reservoir of narrative potential that can be hinted at or referenced without ever being fully tapped. The moment you define what they were, you close off all the other possibilities they might have been. Given that Warhammer 40,000 is an ongoing commercially successful setting that needs to remain flexible for decades of future development, maintaining such options is simply good business sense. Fifth, and perhaps most philosophically significant, some questions are more powerful unanswered. The Lost Primarchs work as narrative devices precisely because they're absent. They represent all possible failures, all potential betrayals, all forms of disappointment that Primarchs could embody. They're simultaneously gene-seed disasters, ideological heretics, chaos converts, xeno-sympathizers, military incompetents, and tragic victims of circumstance. Any specific answer would reduce their symbolic weight, transforming them from universal warnings into particular examples. The ambiguity lets them serve as whatever cautionary tale each reader needs them to be. Games Workshop has actually doubled down on this approach in recent years, using the Lost Primarchs more explicitly in their storytelling, while being even more careful never to provide concrete answers. The first Heretic discusses them more openly than previous works, but always obliquely, always with emotional resonance rather than factual clarity. The Sigillite reveals that memories were suppressed, but not what those memories contained. More recent Horus Heresy novels occasionally reference the lost, but always in ways that generate more questions than answers. This isn't accidental, it's deliberate escalation of the mystery providing engagement without resolution. There's also a comparison to be made with the inspiration for the Lost Legions, the genuinely lost legions of ancient Rome. The Roman military numbered its legions, and historical records show gaps where certain legion numbers aren't accounted for. The Ninth Legion famously disappeared in Britain, vanishing from records without clear explanation. These real-world mysteries fascinated Priestley and influenced his decision to create similar gaps in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Just as historians will likely never know for certain what happened to Rome's lost legions, fans will never know for certain what happened to the emperors. The parallel is deliberate, lending the fiction a texture of historical realism through acknowledged incompleteness. This approach stands in interesting contrast to other mysteries in Warhammer 40,000 that have been, or are being, resolved. We've learned about the Emperor's origins through Master of Mankind and related texts. We've seen the return of Primarchs like Leman and Lionel Johnson in the modern setting. We've explored the creation of the Primarchs themselves in the first Heretic. Games Workshop is willing to answer some mysteries, to define some elements that were previously ambiguous, but the Lost Primarchs remain sacrosanct, protected by editorial policy, deliberately excluded from the gradual revelation of previously hidden truths. This special status itself tells us how important they are to the setting's structure. It's worth noting that this approach has precedents in other successful fictional universes. The Ringwraiths in The Lord of the Rings were powerful, terrifying figures, and Tolkien deliberately left most of them unnamed and without detailed backgrounds, allowing them to serve as universal symbols of corruption rather than 9 individual tragic figures. Many successful horror franchises understand that showing the monster too clearly reduces its effectiveness. Mystery itself is a feature, not a bug, and managing that mystery over decades requires discipline and careful planning. For players and fans, this means accepting that the Lost Primarchs will remain what they've always been. A question without answer, a gap that won't be filled, a mystery that enriches the setting through its persistence rather than its resolution. It means making peace with the fact that your personal theory about what happened will never be confirmed or denied. It means understanding that when you discuss the Lost Primarchs with other fans, you're not working toward a revealed truth, but rather exploring the space of possibilities, each as valid as any other because none can be definitively proven wrong. And perhaps there's something beautiful in that. Something that fits perfectly with Warhammer 40,000's grim dark aesthetic. In a setting where knowledge is suspect, truth is dangerous, and power demands ignorance, what could be more thematically appropriate than a central mystery that cannot be solved? The Lost Primarchs embody the very nature of the Imperium itself, vast, powerful, built on foundations that no one fully understands anymore, carrying secrets that are perhaps better left unknown, functioning despite and perhaps because of the gaps in its own history. The lost will stay lost. The forgotten will remain forgotten. The purged will stay purged. Not because their stories don't matter, but because their absence matters more than any presence could. They're the silence between notes in a grand symphony, the negative space in a complex painting, the darkness that makes the light visible. Games. Workshop understands this, and so they'll never give us the answer we think we want, because what we actually need is the question itself, endlessly posed, permanently unresolved, forever haunting the edges of the Imperium's greatest myths. One of the most haunting aspects of the Lost Primarchs' mystery is what their erasia tells us, when compared to how the Imperium treated the 9 Traitor Primarchs who followed Horus into heresy. This comparison is crucial because it reveals just how severe whatever happened to the 2nd and 11th must have been. The Traitor Primarchs nearly destroyed the Imperium, unleashed chaos across the galaxy, killed billions, and shattered the Emperor's dreams. Yet they were not erased from history. Their names are remembered, their deeds recorded, their legacies acknowledged even as they're condemned. So what could the Lost have done that was worse than that? Consider what the 9 Traitors actually accomplished in their rebellion. Horus, the War Master himself, turned 9 Space Marine legions against the Emperor, prosecuted a civil war that consumed the galaxy for years, laid siege to Terra itself, and personally wounded the Emperor so severely that he's been entombed on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, neither truly alive nor fully dead. Angron became a demon prince, and continues to ravage Imperial space in the name of Khorne. Magnus shattered, turning from desperate saviour to willing pawn of Tzeentch. Mortarion and his Death Guard became plague-ridden monsters spreading Nurgle's gifts across 1,000 worlds. Fulgrim descended into Slaaneshi excess so profound that his very presence corrupts reality. Lorgar and his word-bearers were the architects of the entire betrayal, the ones who corrupted Horus in the first place. Perturabo's cold bitterness led to immeasurable suffering. Alfarius and Omegon's machinations seeded confusion and treachery throughout the Imperium. Conrad Curse's night-haunted atrocities terrorized entire sectors. These are literally the worst criminals in human history. They betrayed the Emperor, killed their brothers, destroyed billions of lives, and damned humanity to an eternity of warfare and suffering. Their actions led directly to the creation of the grimdark Imperium of the 41st millennium, a fascist nightmare of eternal war where a quadrillion humans suffer under brutal theocratic tyranny, specifically because of what these 9 did. If there's a crime you could commit against the Imperium, the Traitor Primarchs committed it and then some, yet they're not forgotten. Their names are curses, yes. Their symbols are forbidden. Their worship is heresy punishable by death. Their very mention in polite company is considered dangerous. But mention them you can. Imperial. Historians record their rebellion in detail. Space Marines are taught about the heresy, so they'll recognise the signs of corruption. The Inquisition studies the Traitor's fall to understand how to prevent similar betrayals. Their statues were defaced but not removed. Their legions are listed as excommunicate traitorists, explicitly noted in Imperial rolls even as their status condemns them. Every Space Marine knows the name Horus. Every citizen of the Imperium who's educated enough to know anything of history knows about the Traitor legions. The Imperium made the traitors into cautionary tales, into examples of what happens when you turn from the Emperor's light. Their damnation serves a pedagogical purpose. This is what chaos looks like, the Imperium says. These are the faces of betrayal. Learn them so you can recognize the enemy. It's the same logic that makes public executions of criminals a deterrent. The punishment is remembered so that others won't follow the same path. But the lost Primarchs weren't treated this way. They weren't made into examples. They weren't publicized as warnings. Instead, they were comprehensively, totally, absolutely erased. Not just their deeds, but their names. Not just their failures, but their existences. You can't learn from the lost Primarchs' mistakes because officially they never existed to make those mistakes. You can't avoid their fate because you don't know what their fate was or why they suffered it. So why the difference? Why were the 9 who nearly destroyed everything remembered, while the 2 who did something else were forgotten? Several possible explanations present themselves, each more unsettling than the last. The first possibility is that what the Lost did was more threatening to the Imperium's ideology than outright rebellion. Chaos is external, other, something the Imperium can define itself against. We're not chaos is a clear identity. But what if the Lost represented internal contradictions, flaws in the Imperium's own logic that couldn't be dismissed as external corruption? What if one of them proved that the Emperor's methods were unnecessarily cruel? What if another demonstrated that the Imperial truth was built on lies? These would be more dangerous than chaos because they would attack the Imperium from within its own premises. You can't make them into evil outsiders because they were using the Imperium's own values against it. Better to erase them entirely than to acknowledge that such criticism could come from the Emperor's own sons. The second possibility is that their crimes were less spectacular, but more psychologically damaging. Horus's betrayal was monstrous, but it was comprehensible. Ambition, corruption, the lust for power. That's a story humanity has told itself throughout history. But what if the Lost's failures were more prosaic, more relatable, more frighteningly human? What if one of them simply broke under pressure, couldn't handle the responsibility, had a mental collapse? What if another was just inherently weak, not evil or corrupted, but simply inadequate? These failures would be far more terrifying to Space Marines and Imperial citizens, because they suggest that even the Emperor's greatest creations can fail not through some grand betrayal, but through simple human fragility. That's a truth the Imperium cannot afford to acknowledge. The third possibility is that their ends were too horrifying to contemplate. Horus died. The traitors who survived became demon princes or fled into the Eye of Terror. These fates are terrible, but they're conclusive, contained. But what if what happened to the Lost couldn't be contained? What if they suffered fates that suggested the Primarchs, and by extension all Space Marines, were more vulnerable than anyone wanted to admit? If a Primarch could be enslaved by Xenos technology, if his mind could be destroyed by conventional torture, if his body could degrade into something unrecognizable, these possibilities would shake faith in the entire Space Marine project. The Imperium needs its citizens and soldiers to believe Space Marines are invincible demigods. Evidence to the contrary must be suppressed. The fourth possibility is timing. The Lost disappeared during the Great Crusade when the Imperium was still establishing its identity and mythology. Making examples of failed Primarchs at that stage might have fractured the unity the Emperor was building. By contrast, when the heresy happened, it was a clear US versus them conflict that could be narratively packaged as a test that the Imperium passed, albeit barely. Recording the traitors' deeds reinforced that the Loyalists had prevailed, that chaos had been defeated, temporarily, that the Imperium's faith and determination had won the day. The Lost offered no such reassuring narrative. Whatever happened to them suggested flaws in the Imperium's foundation, cracks that appeared before the structure was even complete. These couldn't be integrated into a triumphant story of survival, so they had to be excised entirely. The fifth, and perhaps most disturbing possibility, is that the Emperor personally loved the Lost more than he loved the Traitors, or at least regarded them differently. The Emperor is famously ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for his goals. But he's also been shown to have something approaching genuine affection for some of his sons, particularly Horus before the betrayal. What if the Lost Primarch's failures broke his heart in ways that the Traitors' betrayals did not? What if he couldn't bear to remember them, couldn't bear to see their names and be reminded of what they'd been and what they'd become? The erasure might have been as much about the Emperor's own grief as about practical concerns. And if the Emperor, cold and calculating and nearly omniscient as he is, found these losses too painful to acknowledge, what does that tell us about how terrible those losses must have been? There's also the question of what the Traitors themselves think about the Lost. In the first Heretic, the Word-bearers discuss the Lost, and there's no sense of kinship or recognition. The Traitors don't claim the Lost as predecessors who showed them how to defy the Emperor. They don't invoke the Lost as justification for their own rebellion. In fact, they seem to regard the Lost's fate as shameful, something to be avoided. Even Argael Tal, when contemplating whether to kill the 11th Primarch in infancy, frames it as preventing a shameful future, suggesting the word-bearers themselves don't want to be associated with whatever that Primarch did. This is particularly striking because Chaos worshippers generally have no shame. They revel in excess, in corruption, in violation of every social norm. If even Chaos Marines think the Lost's fate was shameful, if even traitors who helped orchestrate the galaxy's greatest betrayal want nothing to do with that particular legacy, whatever the Lost did must have been uniquely awful, even by the standards of beings who traffic with demons. The comparison ultimately reveals that erasure is reserved for threats more fundamental than military rebellion or ideological betrayal. The 9 traitor Primarchs could be integrated into the Imperium's narrative because they represented external corruption, chaos as enemy, clear lines of good and evil. But the Lost represented something that couldn't be integrated, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be packaged into the Imperium's mythological structure. They represented flaws, questions, contradictions, failures that went to the heart of what the Imperium was and what the Primarchs were meant to be. Horus could be the arch-traitor, the great enemy, the devil figure in the Imperium's theology, but the Lost had to be nothing at all. Their absence is more powerful than any presence could be, because it preserves the Imperium's core mythology, while acknowledging, through silence, that not everything went according to plan, that even the Emperor's perfect creations could fail in ways too terrible to remember. The empty plinths stand as testament not to grand betrayals, but to failures so complete that even acknowledging them would threaten everything the Imperium claims to be, and so the Lost remain lost, erased not just from history but from the very category of traitor, considered somehow worse than those who damned humanity to 10,000 years of suffering, memorable only through their absence. Cautionary tales with no tale to tell. That, more than anything, is what makes them so deeply unsettling. Not what they did, but the fact that whatever they did was serious enough that the Imperium preferred forgetting to remembering, preferred silence to example, preferred mystery to understanding. In a universe of horrors, they represent the horror too great to name. The Lost Primarchs, even in their absence, tell us crucial truths about the Imperium of Man, the Emperor, and the nature of the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. Their erasure isn't just a plot point or a bit of mysterious lore, it's a window into how the Imperium operates at its deepest levels, revealing uncomfortable truths about power, loyalty, perfection, and the cost of maintaining an authoritarian regime built on lies and suppression. First and foremost, The Lost Primarchs demonstrate that the Emperor was willing and able to destroy his own creations when they failed to meet his standards or fulfill their purposes. This isn't surprising in theory. The Emperor is consistently portrayed as ruthlessly pragmatic, willing to sacrifice anything for the greater good as he defines it. But there's a difference between understanding this intellectually and seeing it applied to his own gene sons, beings he personally created, who shared his genetic material, who were meant to be the pinnacles of his achievement. The Emperor didn't just abandon or imprison or exile the Lost Primarchs. He erased them so thoroughly that their names became unspeakable, their deeds unrecorded, their very existence transformed into a gap in history. This is the action of someone who views even his most personal relationships in purely utilitarian terms. The Primarchs were tools, and when tools broke or proved unsuitable, they were discarded without sentimentality. What does this tell us about the Emperor's relationship with his other sons? If he could erase 2 Primarchs, he could theoretically have erased any of them. Every Primarch existed under the shadow of potential obliteration should they displease their father sufficiently. This creates a dynamic of fear underlying the supposed familial bonds. The Emperor might have loved his sons in some abstract sense, but he loved his vision more, and when those came into conflict, the sons would always lose. Knowing this, even subconsciously, would have coloured every Primarch's interaction with their father, creating a fundamental insecurity beneath all the superhuman confidence. Second, the suppression of memories through psychic manipulation reveals the Imperium's fundamental relationship with truth and knowledge. The decision to mind-wipe not just the Lost Legion's Space Marines, but also the surviving Primarchs, shows an institutional commitment to reality control that goes beyond simple propaganda or censorship. The Imperium didn't just want people not to talk about the Lost. It wanted them not to remember, not to think about them, not even to be able to conceptualize that something was missing. This is totalitarianism at its most complete, not just controlling what people say or do, but controlling what they think and remember, shaping consciousness itself to align with the official narrative. And critically, this decision came not just from the Emperor, but from the request of loyalist Primarchs, like Dorn and Guilliman. The totalitarian impulse wasn't imposed from above against resistance. It was embraced by those who should have been most committed to truth. These were rational, intelligent beings who nonetheless decided that collective ignorance was preferable to uncomfortable knowledge. This suggests that the rot in the Imperium, the willingness to suppress truth for convenience, wasn't just a feature of the Emperor's tyranny, but was actively perpetuated by those who claimed to serve higher ideals. Third, the Lost Primarchs establish a precedent that would resonate throughout Imperial history. If the Emperor could erase 2 Primarchs, what else might he erase? How much of Imperial history is similarly edited, sanitized, redacted? The answer, as any student of Warhammer 40,000 lore knows, is quite a lot. The Imperium of the 41st millennium routinely suppresses information, declares knowledge heretical, burns books and archives, and rewrites history to suit current political needs. The Inquisition has a special order, the Ordo Hereticus, largely devoted to controlling information and eliminating dangerous knowledge. Entire worlds have been placed under seal or exterminatus to prevent heretical information from spreading. The mechanisms for all of this were established during the Great Crusade, perfected on the Lost Primarchs before being applied more broadly. From this perspective, the Lost represent the prototype for Imperial information control. They were the first victims of Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory that would become standard practice for the Imperium when dealing with inconvenient truths. Every time the Inquisition declares a planet's population to be purged because they learned something they shouldn't, every time a chapter's history is redacted, every time knowledge is declared heretical, and those who possess it are executed, it's an echo of what was done to the Second and 11th. The mechanism for forgetting, once developed, proved too useful to be used just once. Fourth, the Lost Primarchs reveal the limits of even the Emperor's foresight and ability. The fact that 2 of his 20 Primarchs failed badly enough to require erasia suggests that despite all his power and planning, the Emperor could make mistakes. The Primarch project wasn't perfect. The Great Crusade's strategies weren't flawless. The Emperor himself wasn't infallible. This is a truth that the Imperium could never officially acknowledge because the entire Imperial system rests on faith in the Emperor's divine perfection. If he could be wrong about 2 Primarchs, what else might he have been wrong about? This becomes particularly important when considering the Horus Heresy. If the Emperor had already experienced catastrophic Primarch failures with the Lost, why didn't he take steps to prevent similar failures with the others? Did he not recognize the warning signs? Did he recognize them but believe he could manage them? Or worst of all, did he simply not care, willing to risk his son's corruption if it served his larger plans? The existence of the Lost suggests that by the time Horus turned, the Emperor had already dealt with Primarch failures at least twice. Yet he didn't implement safeguards, didn't establish better oversight, didn't create systems to detect and contain corruption. This either speaks to incredible arrogance or suggests that perhaps the Emperor's goals were more complex and more willing to accept casualties than generally believed. Fifth, the emotional impact on the surviving Primarchs created psychological vulnerabilities that would later be exploited during the heresy. The Lost represented proof that even Primarchs could fail and be erased. This knowledge, even suppressed, created anxiety and insecurity. Sanguinius feared the same fate for the Blood Angels. Magnus must have worried about the Thousand Sons. Angron was already discarded in a sense, with the Emperor refusing to save his rebel companions. Conrad Cursor predicted his own dark fate, and seemed almost to embrace it. The Lost established that the Emperor's love, such as it was, had conditions and limits. This made the Primarchs more susceptible to Chaos's offers, because Chaos, paradoxically, promised unconditional acceptance. The Dark Gods would love you despite and because of your flaws. They wouldn't erase you for failing to meet impossible standards. Sixth, the method of the Lost Legion's disposal, particularly the absorption of their Space Marines into other legions, reveals how the Imperium values genetic resources over individuals or even ideals. The Space Marines who served under the Lost Primarchs were mind-wiped and repurposed rather than destroyed, despite potentially being complicit in whatever their Primarchs did. This pragmatism would become characteristic of the Imperium. Waste nothing, repurpose everything, accept any compromise if it preserves resources. The same logic would later justify using penal legions, servitors created from criminals, and countless other brutal practices. The Lost Legion's Space Marines were the first to experience this transformation from thinking beings into resources to be managed, their identities sacrificed for efficiency. Seventh, the secrecy around the Lost demonstrates that the Imperium was, from its inception, built on lies. The Imperial truth, the supposedly enlightened philosophy that rejected religion and superstition in favour of reason and science, was itself a lie. The Emperor knew about chaos, knew about the warp's dangers, and deliberately concealed this knowledge from his sons and subjects. The erasure of the Lost Primarchs was simply another lie in a system built on deception. This fundamentally undermines any claim the Imperium might make to moral superiority. If your founding philosophy requires lying to your people, if your greatest achievements rest on suppressed truths, what legitimacy do you really possess? Finally, the Lost Primarchs remind us that the Imperium of Man is, at its core, a tragedy. Not in the sense of a sad story, but in the classical sense of a narrative about flawed heroes whose very virtues lead to their downfall. The Emperor was brilliant, powerful, visionary, and those qualities led him to overreach, to create beings he couldn't fully control, to build an empire too vast to manage, to make commitments he couldn't keep. The Lost Primarchs represent the first cracks in the facade, the first hints that the Great Crusade couldn't succeed as planned, the first evidence that even the Master of Mankind could fail. Their erasure was an attempt to hide those cracks, to maintain the facade, to pretend the system was working when it was already beginning to fracture. And in a sense, the erasure worked. The Imperium continued for another few centuries before the heresy. The remaining Primarchs went on with their missions. The Great Crusade rolled forward, conquering worlds, spreading the Imperial truth, building the galaxy-spanning domain the Emperor had envisioned. But the suppressed truth remained, buried but not gone, a fault line running through the foundation of the entire structure. When the heresy finally came, when half the Primarchs turned traitor, and the Imperium tore itself apart, perhaps it was inevitable. The rot had been there from the beginning, visible in those empty plinths, audible in the silence where names should be, palpable in the grief and fear the Primarchs felt when they thought about their lost brothers. The lost Primarchs, then, are more than just a mystery or a bit of lore trivia. They're a lens through which we can see the Imperium's true nature. Authoritarian, pragmatic, built on suppressed truths, willing to sacrifice anyone including its own heroes for the sake of the grand vision, fundamentally unstable despite its vast power, and tragic in the classical sense because its flaws were inherent in its virtues. The empty plinths stand as testament to all of this, silent witnesses to sins that can't be named, crimes that can't be acknowledged, failures that had to be forgotten so the march of progress could continue, however doomed that march ultimately proved to be. We've journeyed through decades of lore, examined every hint and clue, explored theories ranging from the plausible to the wildly speculative, analysed the emotional weight of absence, discussed the meta-narrative reasons for maintaining mystery, and contemplated what the lost Primarchs reveal about the Imperium itself. And yet, at the end of it all, we're exactly where we started, looking at two empty plinths, knowing only that there should be something there, feeling the weight of absence without fully understanding what's absent. This is as it should be. The Lost Primarchs work as narrative devices precisely because they remain lost, because the mystery endures, because every fan can have their own interpretation. We've covered what we know for certain. Two Primarchs existed, they led legions during the Great Crusade, they participated in the Rangdan Xenocides. Something went catastrophically wrong. They were erased from history by order of the Emperor. Their space marines were mind-wiped and absorbed into other legions, primarily the Ultramarines. The other Primarchs had their memories suppressed at the request of Dawn and Leman, and the secrecy was so complete that even in the 41st millennium most citizens have no idea there were ever more than 18 Primarchs. We've explored the theories: gene seed catastrophe, chaos corruption, xeno-sympathy, ideological heresy, catastrophic military failure, Rangdan infection, genetic experimentation gone wrong, and dozens of variations and combinations of these. Each theory fits some evidence while leaving other aspects unexplained. Each could be true, or none could be true, or the truth could be something we haven't even considered, because we're thinking within the constraints of what makes sense, rather than what would be narratively most devastating. We've examined the Space Wolves' role as executioners, the evidence suggesting they were involved in the Lost Primarchs' fate, and the authorial statements confirming that there will never be a definitive answer about that involvement. We've discussed the emotional weight the Lost carry for the surviving Primarchs, the way their absence creates grief and fear that shapes behaviour and choices even when the specific memories are suppressed. We've analysed what the Lost reveal about the Imperium's relationship with truth, power, and its own mythology. And through all of this, the Lost have remained fundamentally unknowable, deliberately kept that way by Games Workshop's editorial policy, protected as one of the setting's core mysteries that enriches rather than impoverishes the narrative through its incompleteness. This isn't a failure of world building or evidence of poor planning. It's sophisticated storytelling that understands that some questions are more powerful than any answer could be. There's something profound about this. In our modern era of wikis and comprehensive lore databases, where fans expect to know everything about their favourite franchises, where mysteries are meant to be solved, and every question should have a canonical answer, The Lost Primarchs stand as a deliberate refusal of that completeness. They're a reminder that not everything can or should be explained, that mystery has value, that the spaces between notes matter as much as the notes themselves. They're also a reminder of what makes Warhammer 40,000 such an enduring setting. Yes, there are comprehensive codices and detailed novels and elaborate timelines, but underneath all that documentation, there's still genuine mystery, still questions that resist answers, still secrets that remain secret even after decades of exploration. The setting feels vast because it acknowledges its own incompleteness, because it admits that in a galaxy of 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years of history, some things are lost to time, some knowledge is suppressed beyond recovery, some truths are too dangerous to speak. The Lost Primarchs embody this principle perfectly. They're the forgotten history that shapes the present without being understood. They're the trauma that's been repressed but hasn't been healed. They're the lies the Imperium tells itself to maintain coherence. They're the cost of building an empire on suppression and brutality. They're the proof that even the Emperor could fail. They're the warning that power will always protect itself by controlling truth. They're the grief that can't be processed because it can't be acknowledged. They're the absence that's more present than any presence could be, and perhaps most importantly, they're yours. Whatever you decide they were, whatever theory you find most compelling, whatever interpretation makes the most sense to you, that's valid. Games Workshop will never contradict you because they'll never provide the canonical answer. The Lost Primarchs belong to the community, to the discourse, to the collective imagination of everyone who's ever looked at those empty plinths and asked, what happened? Your answer is as real as anyone else's. This is what invitational incompleteness looks like in practice. It's not a gap in the lore that needs filling. It's a space for creativity, for interpretation, for ongoing engagement with the setting. It's an invitation to participate in the construction of meaning, rather than simply consuming pre-digested narrative. It makes you an active co-creator of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, rather than a passive consumer of official product. So where does that leave us at the end of this deep dive, with 2 empty plinths still standing in the Imperial Palace, still testifying to absence, still raising questions that can't be answered? With the knowledge that whatever happened to the 2nd and 11th was terrible enough that the Emperor himself wanted it forgotten, that Dawn and Leman asked for their own memories to be suppressed, that the other Primarchs speak of them, when they speak at all, with haunted sadness. With the understanding that the lost represents something about the Imperium's foundation, about its willingness to sacrifice truth for convenience, about the price of building empire on genetic engineering and authoritarian control, the Lost Primarchs will never come back. They will never be explained. Their statues will never stand on those plinths. Their names will never be spoken in the halls of the Imperial Palace. Their deeds will never be recorded in the Imperium's histories. They are gone, not just dead, but erased, eliminated so thoroughly that only the fact of their elimination remains. And that's beautiful in its way. Tragic, certainly. Disturbing, absolutely. But beautiful nonetheless, because it means that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there are still mysteries that endure, still secrets that resist revelation, still silences that speak louder than words. The Lost Primarchs are the question mark at the heart of the Imperium, the gap in the grand narrative, the admission that even the master of mankind couldn't control everything, couldn't foresee everything, couldn't create perfection no matter how hard he tried. They're lost, and they'll stay lost, and that loss is their legacy. The forgotten and the purged, absent but never truly gone, shadows cast by empty space, names that were never spoken but somehow still echo through 10,000 years of history. They haunt the Imperium like ghosts, these brothers who never were, these Primarchs who couldn't be, these failures too complete to acknowledge. So the next time you see those empty plinths, either in artwork or in your imagination, take a moment to appreciate them. Not despite their emptiness, but because of it. They're a testament to the complexity of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, to Games Workshop's sophisticated understanding of storytelling, to the power of absence, and to the enduring appeal of questions that have no answers. The Lost Primarchs are lost. Long may they remain so. Thanks for joining me on this deep exploration of one of Warhammer 40,000's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Lost Primarchs, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium for more comprehensive lore videos exploring the dark corners of the 40k universe. Drop your own theories about the Lost Primarchs in the comments below. What do you think happened to them? Gene seed corruption? Rangdan infection? Xeno-sympathy? Something we haven't even considered? I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these mysteries, and if you want to see more videos like this, in-depth explorations of 40k lore covering topics that deserve far more than surface-level treatment, let me know what subjects you'd like to see covered next. The Horus Heresy is full of unexplored corners, the Great Crusade holds countless secrets, and the 41st millennium has mysteries stretching across 1,000,000 worlds. We're just getting started here at Obsidian Scriptorium, and I want to hear what you're most interested in learning about. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also secrets, mysteries and questions that span 10,000 years. Some answers can be found if you look hard enough. Others, like the fate of the Lost Primarchs, remain forever just beyond reach, forever haunting the edges of the Imperium's greatest stories, forever reminding us that even in a universe of horrors, some things are still too terrible to fully comprehend. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop exploring the depths of the lore. The Obsidian Scriptorium will be here, delving into the dark places, asking the hard questions, and bringing you the most comprehensive lore analysis in the 40k community.